There is something quietly remarkable about a river that floods on purpose. Not a flood born from storms, not a sudden surge from distant mountains catching fire with rain, but a flood that comes slowly, gently, almost politely, arriving at roughly the same time each year, laying down a thin blanket of dark earth, and then retreating again, as if it had only stopped by to leave a gift on the doorstep. That river is the Nile, and the gift it left, year after year for thousands and thousands of years, was the entire foundation of one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known. Welcome. If this is your first time here, you have found a quiet corner of the internet that exists for one purpose only: to help you rest. To give your mind something gentle to follow, something soft to drift alongside as the day slowly releases its hold on you. My name, in a sense, is this voice, and I will be your companion for the next few hours as we travel, very slowly back through time, to a place of sand and sky and water, to the banks of a river that changed everything. If you find yourself enjoying this, if you find that this kind of slow, unhurried history is the thing your mind needed, consider subscribing to the channel. There is no pressure and no urgency in that request. Simply, if this feels like the right place for you, the button is there, and it will bring you back whenever you need it. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Imagine yourself standing somewhere very still. The air around you is warm, not uncomfortably so, but warm the way afternoon warmth feels when you have found a patch of shade. The heat is present, but it is not pressing against you. It is simply there, like background music. You're standing at the edge of something. A wide, flat land stretches before you, and the sky above it is enormous. The kind of sky that only exists in very flat places, where there is nothing to interrupt the view from horizon to horizon. The sky is a deep, rich blue, darker than you might expect, because the air here is dry and clear, and does not scatter light the way humid air does. Beneath your feet the ground is soft. Not soft like mud, but soft like very fine, very dark earth, the kind of earth that crumbles slightly between your fingers and leaves a rich, almost sweet smell behind. This earth is called silt. It has come from far away, from mountains you cannot see, from lakes and plateaus thousands of miles to the south. It has travelled here slowly, carried by water, and it has been deposited here the way a river deposits everything it carries when it finally slows down and spreads out. You're standing on a floodplain, and just beyond the edge of where you are standing, the river runs quietly past. The Nile. Even here, even now, the word carries a kind of weight. The Nile. It is one of those words that seems to contain something larger than itself, like the word ocean or the word cathedral. It is not just a river. It is the longest river in the world, stretching over 4,000 miles from its farthest source, somewhere in the mountains of Central Africa, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, where it fans out into a wide green triangle of delta and then disappears into the blue. But what makes the Nile extraordinary is not its length, it is its behaviour. The style floods, or rather, the Nile flooded. Every single year, for millions of years before human beings arrived, and for thousands of years after, the Nile would rise. It would begin to swell sometime in midsummer, and it would continue rising through the long, hot months, spreading gradually outward from its banks, covering the flat land on either side in a shallow sheet of dark, silty water. Then, slowly, over the course of weeks and months, it would recede, pulling back to its banks, leaving behind everything it had carried, every particle of rich, dark soil, every trace of nutrient and mineral that had washed down from the Ethiopian highlands, where summer rains fell in enormous quantities, And what was left behind after the water was gone was the most fertile soil in the ancient world. This is the bad habit the title refers to, the flooding. The annual inundation that every farmer in ancient Egypt planned their entire year around, that every pharaoh tried to understand and predict and celebrate, that every scribe recorded and every priest interpreted and every ordinary person simply accepted as the fundamental rhythm of life. The Nile floods, the earth is renewed, the grain grows, people eat, civilization continues. It sounds simple when you say it that way, and in a sense it was. But the details, the extraordinary, quietly fascinating details of how that simple cycle shaped everything about ancient Egyptian life, from the way they planted their crops to the way they thought about death and the afterlife, from the way they built their cities to the way they counted their years. Those details are what we're here to explore tonight. So let yourself settle. Let your body grow heavier. Let the warmth of the imagined Egyptian afternoon rest on your shoulders like a gentle hand. We have nowhere to be. We have no reason to hurry. We're going to follow the Nile. We're going to watch it rise and fall. And in doing so, we're going to watch an entire civilization come to life. Let us start with the geography, because in ancient Egypt, geography was almost everything. Egypt is a desert country. That is the first thing to understand, the thing that shapes everything else. The vast majority of modern Egypt, and ancient Egypt was no different, is desert. Bone dry, utterly inhospitable desert. The kind of place where almost nothing grows, where the sun beats down without mercy, where the ground is pale sand or cracked rock or gravel that radiates heat long after the sun has set. But running through the middle of this desert is the river, and along the river there is a narrow strip of green. The ancient Egyptians called it the Black Land, Kemet in their language, for the dark colour of the silt-enriched soil. Everything beyond it, everything that was not touched by the Nile's annual gift, they called the Red Land Deshret, the desert, the place where nothing lived, nothing grew, nothing could be sustained. The Black Land and the Red Land, Kemet and Deshret, life and death, green and pale. These were not just geographical categories. They were moral categories, spiritual categories. They described the fundamental division of the world as the ancient Egyptians experienced it. And the line between them, the line between green and gold, between life and emptiness, was drawn by the Nile. Imagine looking at Egypt from above, from a very high place. Below you can see the pale expanse of the desert spreading in every direction, to the east and west and south, enormous and empty. And then, cutting through this emptiness, a thin dark ribbon runs from south to north. On either side of the ribbon, a narrow band of green, fields, trees, the distant glint of irrigation channels. And the ribbon itself is the river, brown and slow and wide, reflecting the enormous sky above it. This is what ancient Egypt looked like, a thin stripe of life in an ocean of emptiness. The valley of the Nile in its narrowest parts is only a few miles wide. In some places, you could walk from the desert on one side to the desert on the other side in less than an hour. From the cliffs on the east bank, on a clear day, you could see the cliffs on the west bank, and between them, the cultivated land and the river. Everything that ancient Egypt was. Its food, its art, its religion, its politics, its wars, its daily life, existed within this narrow, elongated strip. A country the shape of a stem, with the delta at its top like a flower. The delta. That is worth describing separately because it has its own character. In the north, as the Nile approaches the Mediterranean, it spreads out. It fans into multiple branches. In ancient times, there were 7 of them, some say, that win their way through flat, marshy land before reaching the sea. The delta was a very different landscape from the narrow valley further south. It was wider, wetter, greener, full of reed beds and marshes and water birds. It was a place where papyrus grew in tall, feathery stands along the waterways. It was a place where fish were plentiful, where hunting was good, where the air was more humid than in the dry south. In ancient Egypt, the south and the north were so different that they were often treated as two separate kingdoms. Upper Egypt was the south, confusingly named because it was higher in elevation, closer to the Nile's source. Lower Egypt was the north, the delta. The pharaoh wore a double crown, symbolizing the unity of these two lands, and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom was one of the foundational stories of ancient Egyptian civilization. But for all their differences, both the south and the north depended on the same thing: the flood. Now, you might wonder, why did the Nile flood? What was the mechanism behind this annual miracle? The ancient Egyptians themselves wondered this. They could not see the source of the flood. They could not travel to the mountains far in the south where the summer rains fell. They could only observe that each year, when the summer came and the heat was at its most intense, and the air was at its driest, the river would begin to rise. To them, this was clearly something divine. The river rose not because of rainfall they could not see, but because a god willed it. The Nile flood was a gift from the gods, specifically in many interpretations, from the god Hapi, a somewhat unusual deity in the Egyptian pantheon, because he was usually depicted as a heavy, round figure with pendulous breasts and a belly that signified abundance. Hapi was neither male nor female in the simple sense. He embodied the flood itself, the fertile power of water, the generosity of the river. Offerings were made to Hapi. Prayers were said. Statues were placed at the water's edge. And the Nilometers, those remarkable instruments we will return to, recorded the height of the rising water with intense attention, because the height of the flood determined everything. But the actual mechanism, the scientific explanation, was something the ancient Egyptians could not have known and did not need to know. The flood happened because of rainfall, not in Egypt, which almost never sees rain, but far to the south, in the mountains of what is now Ethiopia. The Ethiopian highlands receive enormous amounts of rain during the summer monsoon season. This water flows into the Blue Nile and the Atbara River, two of the Nile's most important tributaries, and it surges northward, carrying with it the rich volcanic soil of the Ethiopian mountains. Meanwhile, further south still, the White Nile, which flows from the Great Lakes of Central Africa, provides a more constant, steady flow throughout the year. It is the White Nile that keeps the river alive during the dry months. But it is the Blue Nile and the Atbara that bring the flood. The surge of water that left the Ethiopian mountains in June would arrive in Egypt by July. It would begin to rise around the city of Aswan, in the far south of Egypt, and then slowly, over weeks, the crest of the flood would move northward, reaching Memphis, near the apex of the delta, perhaps 2 months later. The flood was not sudden. It was slow, patient, inexorable. Exactly the kind of event that seems appropriate to the Egyptian character. By late summer, the floodwaters covered the fields. Farmers retreated to their villages on the slightly higher ground above the flood level. They waited. They repaired their tools, worked on buildings, perhaps laboured on the great public works projects that the pharaoh's government organised during the flood months, when agricultural work was impossible. And then, as the summer ended and autumn began, the water receded. Slowly it pulled back. The fields emerged again, dark and glistening, covered in a fresh layer of silt that was, to ancient farmers, more valuable than any treasure. They moved back to their fields. They planted their crops. They waited for the harvest. This cycle, flood, recession, planting, harvest, followed by the dry summer months before the next flood, was the heartbeat of ancient Egyptian civilization. Everything else was organised around it. Let yourself breathe slowly now, in and out. The story's not going anywhere. Neither are you. Imagine you are lying on the banks of the Nile on an evening in late October, perhaps 3,000 years ago. The flood has receded. The ground around you is still slightly damp, the soil dark and soft. The air smells of earth and water and something green, something growing. Above you, the stars are beginning to appear in a sky that is deep indigo at the horizon and almost black directly overhead. You can hear the river. It is always audible, a quiet, constant sound. The sound of water moving over a wide, shallow bed. The Nile is not a loud river. It does not roar. It does not crash. It moves with a kind of settled patience, as if it has been making this same journey for so long that it no longer needs to hurry. In the fields around you, invisible in the gathering dark, farmers have already begun preparing the soil. Tomorrow they will plant. They have seeds, emmer wheat, barley, flax, that they have stored carefully through the flood months. They know what to do. Their parents knew. Their grandparents knew. The knowledge goes back so far that no one can remember a time before it. This is what stability feels like. This is what a civilization built on a reliable, natural rhythm feels like. Not exciting, not dramatic, just deeply, quietly settled. The flood will come, the flood will go, the grain will grow, the year will turn. And somewhere, in a palace far away, or perhaps not so far, a pharaoh is receiving reports about the height of the flood this year, comparing them to the records of previous years, deciding whether the harvest will be good or whether there will be scarcity, making plans and giving orders and trusting, as all pharaohs trusted, in the fundamental generosity of the river. The Nilometer. This is one of those inventions that seems almost too simple to have been transformative, and yet it was. A Nilometer was exactly what it sounds like, a measuring device for the Nile, a way of recording the height of the river. The most basic Nilometers were simply graduated columns, or stepped staircases carved into rock at the water's edge, with marks indicating the depth of the water at various points. More elaborate ones were built as vertical columns set into chambers that were connected to the river by underground channels, so that the water level inside the chamber matched the level of the river and could be read easily from above. There were Nilometers at many points along the river, but the most important ones were at Elephantine Island, near modern Aswan in the south of Egypt, and on Rhoda Island in what is now Cairo. These were the places where the flood was first observed, where the rising water was first measured, and where the crucial question was first answered each year. How high will the flood be? Because the height of the flood mattered enormously. A flood that was too low was a disaster. Without enough water to reach the fields on the edges of the floodplain, those fields would not be renewed with silt, and they would produce poor crops. Insufficient flooding meant potential famine. The historical records of ancient Egypt contain references to years of very low floods and the starvation that followed. But a flood that was too high was also a disaster. An exceptionally high flood could overwhelm the irrigation systems, destroy earthworks and dams, wash away villages that were not high enough above the flood level, and deposit not just silt but sand and gravel that was less useful for farming. Catastrophically high floods were also recorded, and they too brought suffering. The ideal flood fell within a specific range. There were actually names for the different outcomes. A flood that reached a certain height, around 16 cubits at the Nilometer at Elephantine, scholars believe, was considered good. A flood below 14 cubits was a lean year. A flood above 18 was potentially dangerous. These numbers were not just measurements, they were prophecies. They told the priests and the scribes and the pharaoh what kind of year lay ahead, and they allowed the government to plan accordingly. This is one of the reasons ancient Egypt developed such sophisticated administrative systems. When you know in advance that the harvest will be poor, you can draw on reserves. When you know the harvest will be good, you can build up those reserves. The Nilometer readings, transmitted to Memphis and then to wherever the pharaoh happened to be, were the foundation of this planning. Taxes, too, were calculated based on the flood. In years when the flood was good and the harvest was expected to be rich, taxes were higher. In lean years they were adjusted downward. This was not unique to Egypt. Many ancient civilizations adjusted their taxation to agricultural output. But in Egypt the system was particularly refined, because the annual variability of the flood gave the state an early warning system that could be calibrated with considerable precision. The Nilometer at Elephantine still stands, more or less. You can visit it today. It is a somewhat modest structure, a staircase descending into the water with graduated markings on the walls of the chamber. Standing next to it, you can imagine the officials who stood in the same spot 3,000 years ago, watching the water rise, recording the numbers, knowing that the fate of millions depended on what those numbers said. As we continue drifting through this story, let yourself settle a little deeper into whatever surface you're resting on. Notice the weight of your body, the way it presses gently into the bed or the cushion or the floor. You're heavy. You are still. The story continues quietly around you, like the sound of the river. Let us talk about what happened to the land between floods. The floodplain of the Nile during the long dry months needed to be managed. The water that the flood deposited did not simply stay where it landed. It drained away, it evaporated, and if left entirely to its own devices, the fields would dry out before the crops could be properly grown. The ancient Egyptians, therefore, developed an extensive system of irrigation. Irrigation in ancient Egypt was primarily a question of managing basins. The floodplain was divided into large, roughly rectangular basins by low earthwork walls, dikes made of piled mud. When the flood came, these basins filled with water. The water sat in the basins for a period of time, allowing the silt to settle out of the water and coat the basin floor. Then, when the water had soaked in and the flood had receded, the basins were drained through breaches in the dikes, and the farmers could enter to plant. This system, called basin irrigation, was not particularly sophisticated by later standards. It did not involve pumps or complex machinery. It was, in essence, a way of capturing and directing the flood by using the existing topography and some simple earthworks. But it worked. It worked for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians were farmers, and they understood their landscape in the intimate, practical way that comes from generations of observation. Alongside the basins there were channels, narrow ditches that could direct water from the river into fields that might not naturally receive the flood. In the delta, where the land was flat and the channels of the river were numerous, the irrigation networks were more complex, more like a web of interconnected waterways. In the narrower valley of Upper Egypt, the irrigation was more linear, running along the edges of the floodplain. And there were shadufs. A shaduf is a simple hand-operated device for lifting water from a lower level to a higher level. It consists of a long pole balanced on a fulcrum, with a bucket or container on one end and a counterweight on the other. By pulling down on the bucket end, the operator lowers the bucket into the water. By releasing it, the counterweight brings the bucket up and the water can be poured into an irrigation channel above. The shaduf appears in Egyptian tomb paintings from about 4,000 years ago. It was used in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and in many other ancient agricultural civilizations. It is a beautifully efficient device. The counterweight does most of the work, so the operator expends relatively little energy. With a good shaduf and steady arms, A farmer could lift enough water in a day to irrigate a small field. You can still see shadows in use in parts of rural Egypt today. The design has not changed in 4,000 years. There is something quietly wonderful about that continuity. A farmer in a modern Egyptian village raising water with the same basic tool that a farmer in ancient Egypt used. The same movement, the same rhythm, the long pole dipping and rising, the bucket emptying into the channel over and over in a rhythm as steady as breathing. The crops that grew in those irrigated fields deserve their own quiet attention. Emmer wheat was the most important. Not the same as modern bread wheat. Emmer is an older variety with a slightly nutty flavour and a tougher husk that makes it somewhat harder to process. The ancient Egyptians ground emmer into flour, mixed the flour with water, added a leavening agent. They used a kind of sourdough starter, as far as we can tell, and baked it into bread. Bread was the fundamental food. It was what people ate morning and evening. It was what workers were paid in. It was what offerings to the gods consisted of. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that the word for bread in ancient Egyptian was also used more generally to mean food or sustenance. Barley was also important, and it was used primarily to make beer. Beer, in ancient Egypt, was not the frivolous luxury it might seem in a modern context. It was a staple food. It was thick, nutritious, full of carbohydrates and protein and B vitamins. It was safer to drink than river water, because the fermentation process killed pathogens. Workers, soldiers, priests, children, everyone drank beer. The rations given to the workers who built the pyramids included generous allocations of beer. Not as a reward or a perk, but as a dietary necessity, a source of calories and nutrition. Flax was grown for its fibres, which were spun into linen. Ancient Egyptian linen was extraordinarily fine. The best quality linen made from flax that was carefully cultivated and processed with great skill was so thin and smooth that it was almost transparent. This fine linen was used for the garments of the wealthy and the priestly class, for wrapping mummies, for sails on boats. Coarser linen was used for everything else: ordinary clothing, sacks, bandages. Beyond these staples, the Egyptians grew a wide variety of other foods: onions and garlic, leeks and lettuce, beans and lentils, cucumbers and melons. Dates and figs were cultivated in orchards that lined the river. Grapes were grown in vineyards, mostly in the delta, and wine was produced, though wine was more of an elite drink than beer, associated with festivals and the wealthy. The river itself provided fish. The Nile was rich in fish: perch, catfish, tilapia, and many other species. Fish were eaten fresh, and they were also dried and salted and stored, providing a source of protein through the lean months. Fishing was a common occupation along the Nile, and fishermen appear frequently in Egyptian art, depicted in their papyrus boats with their nets and lines. Papyrus boats. Let us pause on that for a moment. Papyrus was perhaps the single most versatile plant in the ancient Egyptian world. It grew in thick stands along the banks of the Nile and in the marshes of the delta, tall stems with feathery heads rising several metres above the water. From papyrus, the Egyptians made writing material. The word paper is derived from papyrus. They made baskets, mats, sandals, rope, and they made boats. A papyrus boat was built by bundling together thick sheaves of papyrus stems and binding them tightly into a long curved shape with the ends turned up. These boats were light, buoyant, and easily repaired. They were used for fishing, for travelling short distances on the river, for hunting in the marshes. Images of them appear in tomb paintings from the earliest periods of Egyptian history. A farmer going out to check his fishing nets, a nobleman going on a hunting expedition in the marshes, a priest crossing the river to reach a temple. All of these might be depicted in a small papyrus boat, moving quietly through the reeds. The larger boats on the Nile were made of wood, which was a more precious material in Egypt, since the Nile Valley itself has very few large trees. Cedar was imported from Lebanon, a long-distance trade that was important enough to send expeditions and maintain diplomatic relationships for. Acacia wood was available locally. From these materials, Egyptian boat builders constructed vessels that could carry enormous loads, stones for building temples, grain from one part of the country to another, soldiers and their equipment, luxury goods for the palace. The Nile was Egypt's highway. There were no roads, not in the modern sense. Travel over land through the desert was difficult and dangerous, but the river provided a natural pathway the length of the country, and because of the prevailing wind direction, winds blow generally from north to south in Egypt, it was remarkably easy to travel in either direction. Going north, from Upper Egypt to the delta, you went with the current. Going south, against the current, you raised your sail because the wind was behind you. This happy coincidence of current and wind meant that Egyptian boats could travel efficiently in both directions without oars, and it is reflected in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs for travel. Going north was shown by a boat without a sail, going with the current. Going south was shown by a boat with its sail raised. Now, let your mind rest for a moment on that image. A wooden boat on the Nile, its sail raised, moving slowly upstream. The river is brown and wide and flat. On either bank, the narrow strip of cultivated land is green and growing. Beyond the cultivation, the cliffs or dunes of the desert. Above everything, the sky, enormous, clear, brilliant blue. This is a scene that would have been repeated millions of times over the course of ancient Egyptian history. Boats on the Nile carrying the goods and people that kept the civilization running. Boats carrying grain to the storehouses at Memphis. Boats carrying granite blocks from the quarries at Aswan to the building sites at Giza and Luxor. Boats carrying the mummified bodies of pharaohs from the East Bank where the living lived, to the West Bank where the dead were buried, because the West was where the sun set, and the setting sun was associated with death and rebirth. That association, the East Bank for the living, the West Bank for the dead, is one of the most elegant examples of how the Nile organised Egyptian thought, not just Egyptian agriculture. The river was not merely a source of water and silt. It was a dividing line between worlds, a symbolic boundary as much as a geographical one. We will return to that symbolism in a little while, but first, let us continue following the agricultural year, because the details of daily life in ancient Egypt are exactly the kind of quiet, unhurried details that this channel exists to explore. After the flood receded and the fields were planted, the next phase of the Egyptian agricultural year was a waiting period. The crops grew slowly as crops do. The fields of emmer wheat turned from bare, dark earth to a soft haze of green shoots, and then, over weeks, to a taller, denser green. The air above the fields was still and dry, the sky clear, the sun moving across it in a great daily arc. During this growing period, farmers had work to do. Irrigation channels needed to be maintained, dikes repaired, weeds managed, animals needed tending. In a country where draft animals, cattle, donkeys, were valuable assets, their care was a constant responsibility. Cattle grazed on the edges of the cultivated land and in the stubble of harvested fields. Goats and sheep were kept. Pigs were kept, though they occupy an ambiguous place in Egyptian cultural life, sometimes associated with Seth, the god of chaos and disorder. And then, around March and April, the harvest came. Harvest time was the busiest, most intense period of the Egyptian year. The grain had to be cut quickly, before the dry heat of late spring could damage it, and it had to be cut at the right moment, not too early, before the grains were fully formed, and not too late. Entire communities participated. The harvest scenes in Egyptian tomb paintings are among the most lively and detailed in all of ancient Egyptian art. Rows of workers bent over the grain with their short wooden sickles, cutting the stalks just below the heads, leaving the long straw to be gathered separately, carrying bundles on their shoulders to the threshing floor. The threshing floor was where grain was separated from the stalks. Animals were driven over the piled grain to trample it, their hooves breaking the grain free from the chaff. Then the grain was winnowed. Workers threw it into the air with wooden scoops, and the wind carried the lighter chaff away while the heavier grain fell back to the ground. This process, repeated many times, produced clean grain that could be stored. Storage was everything. The grain was poured into large pottery jars or into granaries, above-ground structures with domed roofs and small openings at the top through which grain could be poured in, and at the bottom through which it could be extracted. Granaries appear in Egyptian art almost as frequently as threshing floors. They were the literal foundation of security, the physical form of accumulated wealth. The state maintained enormous granaries. In a good year, the pharaoh's storehouses filled with grain that could be distributed in lean years, used to pay workers and soldiers, sent as tribute to allied states, or received as tribute from vassal territories. The management of the storehouses required administrators, scribes who could count and record and calculate, who knew how much grain had come in and how much had gone out, who could tell the vizier or the pharaoh exactly how many months of supplies remained. This need for record-keeping was one of the driving forces behind the development of Egyptian writing. Hieroglyphics, the famous picture writing of ancient Egypt, developed very early. Among the earliest Egyptian written records are administrative documents from around 5,000 years ago, dealing with exactly these matters: grain, labour, goods, taxes. The beautiful religious texts and poetry and stories that we associate with Egyptian writing came later. At the beginning, writing was a tool for accounting, for making sure that the state knew what it had and what it owed. The scribe. Let us spend a little time with the Egyptian scribe, because the scribe is, in some ways, the key figure in the whole system we have been describing. A scribe was someone who could read and write. In ancient Egypt, this was not a common skill. The majority of the population, farmers, craftspeople, soldiers, servants, could not read or write. Literacy was a rare and valuable skill, and those who possessed it occupied a privileged position in Egyptian society. Scribes were trained from a young age, usually starting as children. Their education was long and demanding. Egyptian hieroglyphics consist of hundreds of individual signs, each with specific meanings and pronunciations, and mastering them required years of practice. The scribal schools attached to temples and palaces taught not just writing but also arithmetic, geometry, and the practical knowledge needed for administration. A skilled scribe could rise to great heights in Egyptian society. The position of chief scribe to the vizier, or chief scribe of the temple, was a position of considerable power and privilege. Many of ancient Egypt's most important officials, its administrators, its military commanders, its religious officials, had received scribal training. The image of the scribe that appears most often in Egyptian art is a man seated cross-legged on the ground, his papyrus scroll spread across his lap, his brush poised above the surface. He wears a simple white linen kilt. His expression is calm, attentive. Around him, the world is busy. Workers are harvesting grain, animals are being herded, boats are loading and unloading. But he sits in the centre of this activity like a still point, recording everything, missing nothing. The scribes wrote in ink on papyrus, using small brushes made of rush stems with frayed ends. Black ink was made from soot mixed with a binder. Red ink, used for headings, corrections, and certain categories of information, was made from red ochre. The papyrus surface was smooth and receptive to ink, and a skilled scribe could write very quickly, the signs flowing from the brush in a practiced, almost automatic way. Most of what we know about ancient Egyptian daily life, what people ate, what they wore, what they worried about, how much grain was in the storehouses, what the Nilometer reading said, comes from the records that scribes made. Without the scribes, Egyptian history would be almost invisible to us. With them, it is remarkably detailed. As we continue drifting through the story of the Nile and the civilization that grew along its banks, let your breathing slow a little more. There is no destination we need to reach. We are simply moving through this landscape at a gentle pace, noticing things, letting them settle. Let us think about the gods. The ancient Egyptians had a rich and complex religious life, and their religion was, in many ways, a reflection of their environment. The natural world, the river, the sun, the desert, the stars, was populated with divine presences, and the relationships between these presences formed the mythological framework through which the Egyptians understood the world. We have already met Hapi, the god of the flood, but there were many others. Ra, or Re, was the sun god, and perhaps the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheon during many periods of history. The sun in Egypt was not a benign presence in the way it might be in a northern climate. It was overwhelming, dominant, capable of great destruction, as well as great life-giving power. The Egyptians watched the sun's daily journey across the sky, with the attention of people whose lives depended on it, and they gave it a divine personality. Ra sailing across the sky in his solar bark during the day, and then descending beneath the earth to travel through the underworld during the night, fighting off the chaos serpent Apophis, and emerging reborn each morning in the east. This cycle of daily death and rebirth, the sun setting, passing through darkness, rising again, was intimately connected to the Egyptian understanding of human death and rebirth. The pharaoh, who was both human and divine, was identified with Ra. The dead were associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who had himself been killed and brought back to life. Osiris is one of the great stories of ancient Egypt. He was a good king who was killed by his jealous brother Set, cut into pieces and scattered across the land. His wife and sister Isis gathered the pieces and restored him to life, not to the living world, but to kingship over the dead, over the world beneath. Their son Horus avenged his father by defeating Set and became king of the living world in his turn. This myth, in its many versions, contained the essential ideas of Egyptian religion. Death is not an end, but a passage. Order and chaos are in eternal contest. The righteous will be restored, even if they are cut into pieces. The Nile was present even in this mythology. Osiris was associated with vegetation, with the grain that died each year with the harvest, and was reborn each year with the planting. He was also associated in some interpretations with the Nile itself, with the fertile silt that the flood deposited. The death and rebirth of Osiris was a mirror of the annual death and rebirth of the land. This connection between the river's cycle and the religious calendar was explicit. The festival of Wepet Renpe, the New Year, was timed to coincide with the beginning of the flood season. The rising of the Nile was a divine event, the return of Osiris's generosity to the land. The festival of the flood, celebrated when the waters reached their highest point, was a time of joy and thanksgiving. Religion in ancient Egypt was not separate from agriculture, or from administration, or from daily life. It was woven through all of them. The priests who managed the temples also managed large estates, which produced grain and other goods. The festivals that celebrated the gods also served as redistributive events. when food and goods were shared among the population. The calendar that organised the religious year was also the agricultural calendar, the administrative calendar, the calendar of the flood. The Egyptian calendar deserves a moment of attention because it is a beautiful example of how the Nile organised not just space but time. The ancient Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, each of 4 months. These were not the seasons as we know them: spring, summer, autumn, winter. They were the seasons of the Nile. The first season was Akhet, the season of inundation. This was when the flood came, when the land was covered with water, when farming was impossible and people waited. Akhet began in what we would call late July or early August, when the Nile first began to rise significantly. The second season was Pare, the season of emergence. This was when the flood receded, when the dark, silt-covered land emerged from the water, when farmers returned to their fields and began planting. Pare was the season of growth, of green shoots appearing, of hope and promise. The third season was Shemu, the season of harvest. This was the dry, hot time of year, when the grain matured and was cut, when the land dried out and cracked and turned pale. Shema ended just before the next flood began. Each season was 4 months long, and each month was 30 days long, which gave a year of 360 days. To make up the difference with the actual solar year of approximately 365 days, the Egyptians added 5 extra days at the end of the year, the epigomenal days, which were considered to be the birthdays of 5 major gods: Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The calendar was tied to the stars as well as the river. The rising of the star Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, just before sunrise was an important astronomical marker because it coincided roughly with the beginning of the flood season. Sirius, called Sopdet by the ancient Egyptians, was associated with Isis, and its reappearance in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility was celebrated as a symbol of rebirth and renewal. To look up at the same star, the same Sirius that we can see on any clear night, and to know that it has been marking the same moment, the beginning of the flood season, for thousands of years, is to feel, perhaps, something of the deep temporal continuity of ancient Egypt. The river rose and fell, the star rose and set, the grain grew and was cut, and people lived their lives within this great rhythm, generation after generation. Let us breathe. You are still here. You're still listening. Your body is quiet. You're breathing regular. The voice continues, and the story continues, and you can let both wash over you like the sound of water. If you are finding this helpful, if you are finding that this kind of slow, unhurried companionship through history is what you needed tonight, you might, when you have a moment, leave a like on the video or a comment telling us what brought you here. These small things help the channel find people who might need it. But if you are already drifting, that is more than fine. That is, in fact, exactly as it should be. The story continues. We have talked about farmers and scribes and gods and calendars. But we have not yet talked about the pharaoh, who stands at the centre of all these systems like a still point around which everything else turns. The pharaoh was not simply a king. In ancient Egyptian understanding, the pharaoh was divine, not just a ruler chosen by the gods, but an actual god, the living embodiment of Horus on earth. Upon death, the pharaoh became Osiris, ruler of the dead. The next pharaoh became Horus, and the cycle continued. This divine status was not merely a political convenience, though it certainly was politically useful. It was a genuine belief, embedded in the Egyptian understanding of how the world worked. Order, the Egyptian word was mat, had to be maintained, and the pharaoh was its maintainer. If the pharaoh was just and the rituals were performed and the temples were maintained, mat would prevail. The flood would come at the right time, the crops would grow, and the world would continue. If Maat was disrupted by a bad pharaoh, by neglected rituals, by social disorder, the consequences could be cosmic. The flood might not come, or might be too low or too high. Chaos, represented by the god Set, might overwhelm order, represented by Horus. The world might unravel. This is not a metaphor to the ancient Egyptians. They genuinely believed that the actions of the pharaoh, the performance of rituals, the maintenance of the cosmic order, had direct physical consequences for the world, including the behaviour of the Nile. The pharaoh, therefore, was deeply involved in the religious ceremonies surrounding the flood. There were rituals at the beginning of the flood season, rituals when the flood reached its peak, rituals when it receded. The pharaoh might symbolically cast offerings into the river, or touch the Nilometer, or perform ceremonies at the great temples to invoke the goodwill of the gods. The temples themselves were not simply places of worship in the modern sense. They were, in the Egyptian understanding, the homes of the gods, and maintaining the temples, feeding the god's image 3 times a day with food offerings, bathing and dressing the divine statue, performing the correct rituals at the correct times, was the work of the priests, carried out on behalf of the pharaoh and ultimately on behalf of all of Egypt. The temples were also enormous economic institutions. They owned land, sometimes very large estates, and the produce of that land fed the priests and provided the offerings and supported the complex economic life of the temple. A great temple like Karnak in the south of Egypt was not just a religious centre but an economic powerhouse, employing thousands of people, priests, scribes, farmers, craftspeople, soldiers, and managing vast resources. All of this, the temples, the granaries, the irrigation systems, the administrative apparatus of the state, rested ultimately on the Nile, on the annual flood, on the dark silt and the fertile earth and the grain that grew in it. The pharaoh sat at the top of this system, the farmers at the bottom, and in between the long chain of administrators, scribes, priests, and officials who kept everything running. The vizier. In practical terms, the vizier was the most powerful official in the Egyptian government after the pharaoh. The pharaoh was divine, but the vizier ran things. The vizier, Jeti in the ancient Egyptian language, was the chief administrator, the prime minister, the judge, the organizer of labour, the overseer of taxation, the person whose desk the flood reports arrived at. We know the names of many Egyptian viziers. One of the most famous is Rekhmir, who served as vizier under Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, roughly 3,400 years ago. His tomb at Thebes contains detailed paintings of the duties of the vizier, and from these paintings we can understand something of what the job actually involved. The vizier received petitions from citizens who had grievances. He oversaw the work of the courts and ensured that justice was administered fairly, or at least that it was administered. He organised the labour gangs that built the great public works. He received reports from the administrators of the various nomes, the administrative districts into which Egypt was divided, and forwarded relevant information to the pharaoh. The nomes. Egypt was divided into a number of administrative units called nomes. The word comes from the Greek. The ancient Egyptian term was different, which was something like provinces or counties. Upper Egypt had 22 of them. Lower Egypt had 20. Each nome had its own governor, its own administrative apparatus, its own local deity and temple. This system of administrative divisions allowed the central government to manage a long, narrow country efficiently. The nome governors knew their local conditions, how high the flood reached in their district, what the soil was like, what the local agricultural calendar looked like, and they reported this information upward through the chain of administration to the vizier and eventually to the pharaoh. The remarkable thing about ancient Egypt is how long this administrative system lasted. Other ancient civilizations rose and fell, were conquered and dispersed. Egypt endured. For 3,000 years, from the unification of the country around 3100 BCE to the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, Egypt maintained a recognizable continuity of culture, religion, language, and administrative practice. The pharaoh was sometimes a man and sometimes a woman. Sometimes the country was unified under a strong central government, and sometimes it fragmented into regional powers. But the core of the system, the Nile, the flood, the grain, the scribes, the temples, remained. That continuity is, in itself, one of the most extraordinary things about ancient Egypt. To put it in perspective, the time between the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza and the birth of Cleopatra is longer than the time between Cleopatra and us. Ancient Egypt lasted as a coherent civilization for roughly as long as Christianity has existed. It is almost impossible to fully comprehend that kind of temporal depth. And at the root of it, underlying all of it, enabling all of it, was the Nile. The annual cycle continued. Year after year, millennium after millennium, the flood came and went, and the people planted and harvested, and the scribes counted and recorded, and the pharaohs performed their rituals and built their temples and went to war and made peace and died and were buried in elaborate tombs in the cliffs of the western desert. Let us follow that burial for a moment, because death was such a central preoccupation of ancient Egyptian civilization, and that preoccupation was deeply connected to the Nile. The ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife, and they took extraordinary care to prepare for it. The dead were mummified, their bodies preserved through a complex process of drying and wrapping, and buried with everything they might need in the next world. Food, clothing, tools, furniture, servants in the form of small statues called ushabtis, texts inscribed with spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife. All of this went into the tomb with the deceased. For ordinary people, burial was simple. A pit in the desert sand, the body wrapped in linen, a few objects placed alongside. For the wealthy, burial was more elaborate. A rock-cut tomb in the cliffs, a wooden coffin, perhaps a painted chapel where offerings could be made. For the pharaoh, burial was the most elaborate undertaking imaginable. A pyramid, or a rock-cut tomb in the Valley of the Kings, with chambers full of treasures and texts and objects meant to ensure eternal life. The western bank of the Nile was the land of the dead. The tombs were cut into the cliffs and hills on the west side of the river, in the dry, airless desert where no moisture could reach them, where the bodies could be preserved for eternity. The Valley of the Kings near modern Luxor is perhaps the most famous of these burial sites. A dry, sun-blasted valley cut into the limestone cliffs, where more than 60 pharaohs and other royals were buried over a period of about 500 years. Crossing the Nile from east to west was symbolically crossing from life into death. The priests who carried the mummy of a pharaoh across the river in its elaborate coffin were enacting a mythological journey, the journey of the dead across the waters of the underworld to the realm of Osiris. The river in this symbolic geography was not just a highway. It was the boundary between worlds, and yet the same river that divided life from death also unified them. The flood that renewed the land each year was a resurrection, the earth dying in the dry season and being reborn with the flood, just as Osiris died and was reborn, just as the sun died each evening and was reborn each morning. Life and death, in the Egyptian understanding, were not opposites but partners in an endless cycle. The Nile was the physical expression of that cycle. We are still moving through this story slowly, gently, without haste. The night is deep now, or at least it feels that way. The air around you is quiet. You can feel the weight of your body resting, settling, releasing. Let the voice carry you forward, and do not worry about keeping track of everything. The most important thing is simply to be here. We have been exploring the broad outline of ancient Egyptian civilization, the geography, the flood, the agriculture, the administration, the religion. Now let us go a little deeper. Let us look more closely at how people actually lived, day by day and hour by hour, in this civilization built on the banks of the river. Let us begin with a village. Imagine a small village on the west bank of the Nile, perhaps in the south of Egypt, perhaps 4,000 years ago. It is early morning and the air is cool. Egypt's mornings are often surprisingly cool, even in summer, because the night radiates the heat away quickly in the dry desert air. The sky in the east is pale, not yet fully light. The village is small, perhaps 50 or 60 households. The houses are built of mud brick, sun-dried brick, not fired brick made from the abundant mud of the Nile. Mud brick is a remarkably practical building material in a dry climate. It is cheap, easy to make, easy to repair, and it has excellent thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, keeping the interior cool in summer and warm in winter. It is not a permanent material in the way that stone is permanent, and mud brick houses must be regularly replastered and repaired. But this is not a serious problem in a place where the raw material is literally everywhere. The houses are simple in design, typically 1 or 2 stories with flat roofs. The interior is cool and dim, the walls thick, the windows small and high, placed near the ceiling to allow hot air to escape, while keeping out the worst of the midday sun. The main living area of the house is a room that serves as kitchen, dining room and social space. Off of this are smaller rooms used for sleeping and storage. The roof is used in warm weather as a sleeping area and as a workspace. Grain might be stored on the roof in sealed pottery jars. Tools and equipment might be kept there. In the evening, families might sit on the roof to catch the breeze coming off the Nile, watching the river turn gold and then orange and then dark as the sun set. In the village, we are imagining the morning has begun. The sounds of the early hours are the sounds of animals. A donkey somewhere nearby, the sound of goats being let out. Children's voices, the smell of fire because someone has already lit the cooking hearth. The cooking hearth might be outside in a small courtyard in front of or behind the house, or it might be inside with a hole in the ceiling or roof to let the smoke out. Breakfast is simple. Bread, of course. Flat bread made from emmer flour, baked on a flat stone or in a small clay oven. Perhaps some onions, raw or slightly charred. Perhaps some dried fish if the family has it. Beer in a clay cup, drunk with a special straining tube to filter out the solid particles. There is no tea or coffee. Those drinks come from different parts of the world and different centuries, but there is water from the river, filtered through a clay pot to remove the sediment, and there is beer. After breakfast, the men of the household go to the fields. This is a household in the middle of the growing season, so the main task today is irrigation, walking the channels, clearing any blockages, adjusting the earthwork walls to direct water to the right places. The work is not backbreaking today, but it requires attention and knowledge. A farmer who allows a channel to become blocked, who fails to notice that one section of his field is not receiving enough water, will pay for that neglect at harvest time. The women of the household, and this is a generalization, because Egyptian social roles were somewhat more flexible than those of some other ancient civilizations, remain closer to home. Grinding grain is a daily task. It is done with a simple hand mill called a saddle quern, which consists of a flat stone on which grain is placed, and a smaller rounded stone that is pushed back and forth over the grain to grind it into flour. It is slow, repetitive work. It produces a flour that, if the grinding stones are not perfectly smooth, contains small fragments of stone that get incorporated into the bread and wear down the teeth. Examination of ancient Egyptian skeletons shows that almost all adults had significant tooth wear, caused by this gritty bread. The flour is mixed with water and left to ferment slightly, the sourdough process, before being baked. The bread comes out dense and slightly sour tasting, nutritious but somewhat heavy. It is shaped into round, flat loaves, or into conical loaves if for a formal occasion, or into special shapes for religious offerings. Children, when they are old enough to be useful, help with a variety of tasks: fetching water from the river in clay jars, helping with the animals, carrying messages, gleaning grain from the fields after the harvest. Education for most children is not formal. They learn by watching and helping, by being present in the adult world from a very young age. Formal education, the scribal schools, is for the children of a relatively small privileged class, and even within that class it is primarily available to boys. Girls from wealthy families might receive some education at home, but their opportunities are generally more limited. This is not to say that women in ancient Egypt were without standing. Compared to many other ancient civilizations, Egyptian women had considerable legal rights. They could own property, enter into contracts, inherit equally with their brothers, and testify in court. A wife was not her husband's legal property. She was an independent person with legal standing. Women could work outside the home in a variety of occupations, as weavers, brewers, musicians, dancers, priestesses. There are even a few examples of women in high administrative positions, and of course there were female pharaohs, most famously Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt for about 20 years in the 15th century BCE, and whose monuments are some of the most beautiful in the whole country. But day-to-day life for most women was organised around the household, and the work of the household, cooking, brewing, weaving, child-rearing, managing the stores and supplies, was substantial and essential. The household was not a passive unit in ancient Egypt. It was a productive unit, a small economic enterprise, and the person who managed it was managing something genuinely important. Now the morning has advanced, and the sun is higher. The air is warming. In the fields, the farmers are working with the quiet efficiency of people who know their land well and have been doing this work their whole lives. They know the quirks of each section of their field. This part gets waterlogged, that part drains too fast. They know which channels need cleaning and which are flowing well. They know, from the look of the sky and the feel of the air, what kind of day it will be. There is a rhythm to farm work that is almost hypnotic. The same tasks repeated with slight variation, according to the season, year after year. The same fields tended by the same family, generation after generation. In some cases, farmers worked the same plots of land for many generations, plots that their grandparents had worked, and their grandparents' grandparents before them. This continuity of place creates a particular kind of knowledge, an intimate understanding of the land that cannot be learned from a book or an instruction, but only from years of observation and care. The ox-drawn plough breaks the ground in preparation for sowing. The plough itself is simple, a wooden share with a metal tip pulled by a pair of oxen, guided by the farmer who walks behind. Ploughing in ancient Egypt was not deep work by modern standards. The goal was to disturb the surface of the silt-covered ground, enough to allow seeds to be planted, not to turn the soil deeply. The silt deposited by the flood was soft and workable. It did not need the deep breaking that harder, older soils require. After ploughing, sheep or goats were sometimes driven over the fields to press the seeds into the ground. This simple technique ensured good seed-to-soil contact without requiring additional mechanical effort. Then the waiting began. Patience is, perhaps, the most important quality in a farmer. You cannot hurry grain. You cannot will it to grow faster. You can water it and protect it from pests and pray for good weather, but ultimately you must simply wait and trust that the processes you have set in motion will do what they are supposed to do. The ancient Egyptians were a patient people in this sense. Their civilization was built on patience. on the patient acceptance of the flood's rhythm, on the patient maintenance of irrigation systems and granaries and temples, on the patient accumulation of knowledge and skill across generations. There is something admirable and also something deeply calming about that patience. Let us think about the craftspeople. A civilization is not built by farmers alone. Farmers provide the food that keeps everyone alive, but they cannot build temples, or make pottery, or weave fine linen, or work copper and gold into jewellery and tools. A complex society requires specialists, people who have devoted their lives to mastering a particular craft, who have traded the versatility of the generalist for the depth of the specialist. Ancient Egypt had craftspeople in abundance, and their work was extraordinary. Pottery. The Nile provided clay in unlimited quantities, and Egyptian potters used it to make everything from the coarse storage jars that held grain and water and oil to fine painted vessels used for serving food and drink. The pottery wheel was in use in Egypt from very early periods, allowing potters to produce uniform, symmetrical vessels quickly and efficiently. Egyptian pottery was not, by ancient standards, the most beautiful or the most technically sophisticated. The Greeks and the Chinese, in their different ways, produced finer work. But Egyptian pottery was plentiful, practical, and made with skill. Faience. This is a particularly Egyptian material, and one that deserves special mention. Faience is not actually clay. It is made by coating a core of ground quartz or steatite with a vitreous glaze and firing it. The result is a material that can be made in brilliant colours, most famously, the bright blue-green associated with ancient Egypt, the colour of the sky and the Nile, and can be shaped into small objects, beads, tiles, and decorative elements. Faience was used to make amulets, scarabs, tiles for palace interiors, inlays for furniture and jewellery. It glitters, catching the light, and it was associated with fertility and rebirth because of its colour. Woodworking. Egypt had limited timber, as we have noted, but Egyptian woodworkers made extraordinary use of what was available. Furniture, beds, chairs, chests, boxes, was made with dovetail joints, mortise, and tenon connections, and veneering techniques that are recognisable to any modern woodworker. The furniture found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, made about 3,300 years ago, includes pieces that would not look out of place in an exhibition of fine contemporary craftsmanship. The joinery is precise, the proportions elegant, the decorative inlay work detailed and beautiful. Metalworking. Egypt was not particularly rich in metal ores, but it had access to copper from mines in the Sinai Peninsula and gold from mines in Nubia to the south. Copper was worked from very early periods. Some of the earliest known copper tools and weapons come from Egypt. Later, bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, became the dominant metal for tools and weapons. Gold was abundant enough in ancient Egypt that it was used lavishly in jewellery, temple decorations and royal equipment. The gold that came from Nubia was one of the reasons Egypt paid such close attention to its southern neighbour. Nubia, the land to the south of the First Cataract, the rocky rapid that marked the traditional southern boundary of Egypt, was rich in gold, and Egypt wanted it. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia over several millennia was complex. Sometimes Egypt conquered and administered Nubia as a province. Sometimes Nubia was ruled by its own kings who were closely allied with Egypt, and in one remarkable period Nubian pharaohs actually ruled Egypt. The cataracts of the Nile, the rocky sections where the river tumbled over granite outcrops in a series of rapids and falls, were significant barriers to navigation and also significant landmarks in the political geography of ancient Egypt. The First Cataract near Aswan was the traditional southern boundary of Egypt proper. South of the First Cataract began the land of Nubia, a different country, though closely related to Egypt in culture and religion. The second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cataracts were further south, each one a further step into the African interior. When Egyptian armies marched south into Nubia, as they often did, seeking gold and slaves and other resources, they had to portage around the cataracts, carrying their boats over the rocky ground. It was difficult work, and the cataracts served as natural defensive barriers for the Nubian people. The Egyptians built a series of fortresses along the Nile south of the first cataract to consolidate their control of the Nubian territory, and these fortresses, some of them remarkably well preserved, tell us a great deal about how the Egyptian state organised its military presence on the frontier. Let us step back from the frontier and return to the heart of Egypt. Let us go to one of the great cities, Thebes, or, as the ancient Egyptians called it, Waset. It sits in the south of Egypt, along the Nile, on both the east and west banks. On the east bank, the living city, the temples, the palaces, the markets, the houses. On the west bank, the dead city, the tombs, the mortuary temples, the valley of the kings. The temples of Karnak and Luxor on the east bank of Thebes are among the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. Karnak in particular is not a single temple, but a vast complex of temples, chapels, pylons, obelisks, and sacred lakes, accumulated over centuries by a succession of pharaohs who each added their own buildings to the complex. Walking through Karnak today is an overwhelming experience. The sheer scale of the columns in the hypostyle hall, where 134 massive columns rise to a height of more than 20 metres, creates a sensation of being very small in the presence of something very large. These temples were not museums or monuments in the ancient world. They were working institutions. Every day, at dawn and midday and dusk, priests performed rituals in the inner sanctuaries, purifying themselves with water from the sacred lake, dressing the divine statues, offering food and incense, reciting the liturgical texts. The outer courts of the temples were more accessible to ordinary people, who could come to petition the god, to witness the great public festivals, to receive the food and goods that were distributed as part of the temple's economic function. The great processional festivals brought the gods out of their temples and through the streets. The statue of the god, carried in its sacred bark on the shoulders of the priests, would travel from Karnak to Luxor, or from one bank to the other, accompanied by crowds of worshippers, musicians, dancers, and incense bearers. These festivals were occasions of genuine popular celebration. People lined the route, cheering and singing, making their offerings, perhaps asking questions of the oracle that the moving statue represented, since the god was believed to give answers by the way the bark moved in the hands of the priests, the smell of incense, the sound of sistrums, the rattle-like percussion instruments associated with the goddess Hathor, the sight of the gilded bark, the gleaming statue, the white-robed priests, the shouts of the crowd. These festival days were among the most vivid and memorable events in the lives of ordinary Egyptians who lived their days in relative quiet and occasional privation. The festival was the exception, the extraordinary day, the day when the divine became visible and accessible. And the river was always present. The processional routes often ran along the riverbank. The barks in which the divine statues were carried were modelled on riverboats. The Nile, the giver of life, was woven into the religious landscape as it was woven into the agricultural landscape and the administrative landscape. The Nile in literature. The ancient Egyptians were, among other things, writers. They wrote administrative texts and religious texts and medical texts and mathematical texts, but they also wrote poetry, wisdom literature, stories, and hymns. And the Nile appears in this literature repeatedly, with a warmth and reverence that is still palpable after thousands of years. The Hymn to the Nile, the ancient Egyptian text known as the Hymn to Hapi, is one of the most beautiful things to survive from ancient Egypt. It is a poem in praise of the river and its flood, a long flowing meditation on the gift of water and fertility. It describes the Nile as a father who brings food, as a friend who does not disappoint, as a mysterious being who cannot be questioned about his nature. It celebrates the mud, the silt, the smell of the wet earth, the sight of the green fields growing where there was nothing before. The text was composed perhaps in the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era, though the oldest surviving copies date from slightly later. It was used as a school text. Egyptian scribal students copied it as part of their training, which means it was familiar to educated Egyptians for centuries. Reading it even in translations, even stripped of the flowing rhythm of the original, you can feel the genuine affection for the river. This was not a religious text composed out of obligation. It was a love poem addressed to a river, and the Egyptians meant every word. Other texts describe the agricultural cycle with similar affection and attention. The Wisdom of Amenemop, a collection of moral advice that bears some resemblance to parts of the biblical proverbs, uses agricultural imagery repeatedly. The wise person is compared to a good tree that bears fruit, the wicked person to a dry tree in a field that is never flooded. The imagery of the Nile, of fertility and barrenness, of flood and drought, runs through Egyptian literature because it ran through Egyptian life. Even the love poetry of ancient Egypt, and there is quite a bit of it, surprisingly tender and sometimes surprisingly frank, uses the river as a backdrop. A poem from the New Kingdom period describes a young woman waiting by the river for her beloved, watching the boats on the water, her heart as restless as the current. Another describes a young man so consumed with love that he is unable to eat his bread, a significant statement in a culture where bread was the most fundamental of foods. These poems were composed by people who lived by a river, who depended on a river, who organised their entire lives around the rhythm of a river. The Nile was not just background scenery, it was the fundamental condition of existence. As we continue drifting through this vast and quiet story, let your body sink a little deeper. You've been listening for a while now. You may be very relaxed, or you may still be engaged with the story, following along with the quiet attention of someone who is not yet sleepy, but is settling in that direction. Either way, you're welcome here. Let us talk about the building of Egypt. Not the building of the pyramids, which everyone knows about, but the building of the ordinary infrastructure that kept the country running. Mud brick, as we have noted, was the primary building material for houses, granaries, and most ordinary structures. But some structures required something more permanent, more substantial. The great temples were built of stone, limestone, granite, sandstone, quarried from the cliffs and transported by river to where they were needed. The quarrying of stone in ancient Egypt was a massive logistical operation. The limestone quarries at Tura, on the east bank of the Nile near modern Cairo, provided the fine white casing stones for the pyramids at Giza. The granite quarries at Aswan provided the hardest and most precious stone, used for obelisks, for the inner chambers of pyramids, for statues, for the bases of columns. Working granite with copper and bronze tools, without steel, without iron, is genuinely difficult to imagine, and yet the ancient Egyptians did it, producing surfaces of extraordinary smoothness and precision. Their technique involved pounding the granite with balls of a harder stone, dolerite, which gradually battered away the surface. The work was slow and physically demanding, and the quarry workers must have spent their days in a constant cloud of fine stone dust, breathing air that was bad for their lungs. We know this from the examination of mummies and skeletal remains from ancient Egypt. Many workers who spent their lives at hard physical labour show signs of chronic illness and injury, arthritic joints from years of repetitive motion, worn vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, lung disease from stone dust. The ancient world was beautiful, but it was also physically demanding in ways that we, in our cushioned modern lives, have largely been spared. The transport of stone from the quarries to the building sites was accomplished primarily by boat. A stone obelisk, a tall, pointed monolith sometimes reaching 20 metres or more in height and weighing hundreds of tons, was quarried from the granite shaped in the quarry and then somehow loaded onto a specially built wooden barge and transported down the Nile. The logistics of loading such a massive object onto a boat, keeping the boat from sinking under the weight, navigating the river's currents and shallows, and unloading the obelisk at its destination are not entirely clear, even to modern engineers who have studied the problem. But the Egyptians did it. The obelisks at Karnak, at Luxor, at Heliopolis, the ones that were transported to Rome and Constantinople and Paris and London and New York in later centuries, all began their journeys in the granite quarries at Aswan, loaded onto barges on the Nile carried northward by the current. The Nile was, once again, the enabling condition. Without the river, the transport of stone over such distances would have been impossible. The pyramids at Giza could not have been built without the Nile, not because the pyramid workers needed to drink, though they did, but because the river was the highway that made the whole project logistically possible. The pyramids. We cannot spend time in ancient Egypt without resting in the shadow of the pyramids for a while. They're so familiar, so iconic, that it is hard to see them freshly. But let us try. Imagine approaching the pyramids for the first time, not as a modern tourist driving in from the sprawl of Cairo, but as an ancient visitor approaching across the desert, on foot or by donkey, when the pyramids were newly built and covered in their smooth white casing stones. Polished limestone that would have gleamed in the Egyptian sun with an almost blinding brightness. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of the three main pyramids at Giza, was the tallest human-made structure in the world for about 3,800 years, from its construction around 2560 BCE until the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 CE. It is about 146 metres high in its original form, though it has lost the topmost portion and some of the casing stones, and is now slightly shorter. Its base covers almost 6 hectares. It contains an estimated 2.5 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. These numbers are quoted so often that they have lost their power to surprise. Let us try to restore some of that surprise. Imagine stacking 2.5 million blocks of stone, each block on average the size of a small car. If you laid them end to end, the row would stretch for nearly 4,000 kilometres, roughly the distance from London to Moscow. The precision with which the Great Pyramid's base is levelled is remarkable. Across the entire base, the variation in height is less than 2 centimetres. The sides align with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, to within a fraction of a degree. This was accomplished without modern survey equipment, without computers, without steel tools. With copper chisels and wooden measuring rods and a system of celestial observation, the ancient Egyptians aligned their enormous stone monument with the stars and the compass points to an accuracy that still impresses modern engineers. How? We do not know entirely. We can make reasonable guesses. We know they used the stars to determine true north, probably by observing the path of circumpolar stars around the celestial North Pole. We know they used water levels to establish horizontal baselines. We know they had skilled mathematicians and surveyors. The mathematical knowledge required to plan and build a pyramid is documented in several surviving papyri, and it is sophisticated. But the full picture of how the Great Pyramid was built, the logistics of moving and placing 2.5 million blocks, the organisation of the workforce, the daily routines at the building site, is still debated. We know it was not built by slaves, as was once thought. The evidence from administrative records and from the excavation of the workers' village at Giza shows that the workforce was organised labour. Workers who were fed well, given medical care, rotated through the work in shifts, and buried with some dignity when they died at the site. The workers who built the pyramids ate bread and beer and beef and fish. They lived in a purpose-built village with a bakery, a brewery, a medical facility. They were organised into named gangs. The texts mention groups called the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaura. They scratched graffiti on the stone blocks they were laying, small inscriptions that say things like, "This is done by the strong workers of Khufu or the Star of the Sky," evidence that these were real people with pride in their work and a sense of belonging to a team, and they were fed by the Nile. The grain that filled their bellies had grown in the silt of the flood. The beer they drank had been brewed from barley grown in those same fields. The beef they ate came from cattle that had grazed on the banks of the river. The pyramids were, in this sense, not just monuments to the divine pharaoh. They were monuments to the annual generosity of the Nile. Let us move forward in time a little. We have been in the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, roughly 4,500 to 4,000 years ago. Let us step through the centuries to the Middle Kingdom, a period that some Egyptologists consider the high point of Egyptian literature and art. The Middle Kingdom began around 4,000 years ago, after a period of fragmentation called the First Intermediate Period, during which Egypt had been divided into competing regional powers and had experienced considerable social and economic disruption. Reunification came under the pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties, who ruled from Thebes and then from a new capital, Ichtawi, in the north. The Middle Kingdom was a period of stability, expansion and cultural flowering. It was during this period that some of the finest works of Egyptian literature were composed. The story of Sinuhe, the shipwrecked sailor, the eloquent peasant. These stories are remarkable for their humanistic detail, their interest in individual experience, their willingness to portray characters who are not gods or pharaohs but ordinary people in extraordinary situations. Sinuhe is a court official who flees Egypt after the death of a pharaoh and lives for many years among the people of Canaan and Syria, where he becomes respected and successful, raises a family, fights duels, grows old, but he is haunted by his longing for Egypt, for the Nile, for home. When the new pharaoh offers him amnesty and the chance to return, he goes, and the story describes his return to Egypt with a tenderness that is still moving to read. The sight of the Nile, the feeling of the Egyptian soil, the smell of the familiar air, the longing for Egypt, for the Nile, for the land, for home, is a recurring theme in ancient Egyptian literature. Soldiers on campaign in foreign lands dream of returning. Merchants trading in distant ports ache for the familiar smell of the flood. Even the dead in the funerary texts express a desire to be near the Nile, to see the river again, to stand on Egyptian soil. This deep attachment to place, to the specific landscape of the Nile Valley, is not surprising. Egypt was an extraordinarily distinctive environment, unlike any other place in the ancient world. The sudden transition from desert to river, the overwhelming brightness of the light, the particular colour of the silt-dark water, the smell of the flood, these were powerful sensory experiences, and they formed the emotional core of Egyptian identity. To be Egyptian was to be from the Nile. To be from the Nile was to know, in your bones, the rhythm of the flood. The Middle Kingdom also saw increased activity in Nubia to the south. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty built a series of fortresses along the Second Cataract, massive mud brick structures that were marvels of military engineering. These fortresses controlled the flow of people and goods along the river, and they were garrisoned by Egyptian soldiers who lived in them for months or years at a time, far from home, surrounded by a landscape that was recognisably similar to Egypt but subtly different. hotter, drier, emptier. The letters that some of these soldiers sent home, preserved on papyrus, give us a glimpse of the daily life of an ancient Egyptian military garrison. They ask for beer and bread to be sent. They complain about the heat. They ask for news of family members. They express homesickness in the plain, direct language of people who are not trying to be literary, but are simply saying what they feel. These ordinary human voices, speaking across 4,000 years, are perhaps the most moving thing about ancient Egyptian history. Not the pyramids, not the gold, not the elaborate mythology, but these small, quiet expressions of everyday longing and need. I miss home. Send me something to eat. How is mother doing? The Nile was what they missed. The Nile was home. Now we're drifting into the New Kingdom, the period of Egypt's greatest power and international reach, roughly 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. This is the Egypt of Thutmose the Great, of Hatshepsut, of Akhenaten the heretic pharaoh, of Rameses the Great, of the Battle of Kadesh and the peace treaty that followed it, of the Valley of the Kings and the treasure of Tutankhamun. The New Kingdom pharaohs built their power on military expansion to the north and south, on trade networks that reached from sub-Saharan Africa to the Aegean, on the wealth of Nubian gold and the productivity of the Egyptian agricultural system. But the foundation was still the Nile. The armies that marched into Canaan and Syria and Nubia were fed by Egyptian grain. The temples that the pharaohs built at Karnak and Abu Simbel and all across the country were funded by the agricultural surplus made possible by the annual flood. The diplomatic gifts that were exchanged with the kings of Babylon and Mitanni and Hatti, the great powers of the ancient Near East, included enormous quantities of gold. But gold was nothing without the agricultural base that kept the Egyptian state solvent. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence found at the site of Akhenaten's capital city, dating from the 14th century BCE, reveal the sophisticated international diplomacy of the period. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, negotiating alliances, arranging royal marriages, requesting gold and receiving requests for gold in return. The letters are written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, on small clay tablets, and they give a fascinating glimpse into the international politics of the Bronze Age. But behind the diplomacy, behind the armies, behind the international trade, was the Nile. Always the Nile. Let us stop for a moment and be very quiet. Feel the weight of all this history, not as a burden, but as a gentle presence. Thousands of years of people living their lives along a river, farming its fields, reading its moods, building their civilization in the narrow, fertile strip between desert and desert. The same sunrise every morning, the same stars every night, the same river running past. There is something profoundly restful about the continuity of ancient Egypt. In a world that sometimes feels chaotic and fast-moving, the image of a civilization that endured for 3,000 years, that changed, yes, that had its crises and its collapses and its moments of disaster, but that fundamentally persisted, that kept its language and its religion and its art style recognizable across an almost incomprehensible span of time, is oddly calming. You can let that calm settle into you now. The river keeps running. The flood keeps coming. The grain keeps growing. Nothing that needs doing tonight is urgent. Everything that matters will still be there in the morning. Rest a little now, and when you are ready, or even if you're not ready, even if you're beginning to drift, the story will continue. Let us think about medicine. The ancient Egyptians were among the earliest people to develop a systematic approach to medicine. Their medical knowledge was recorded in papyri, some of which survive more or less intact, and give us a remarkably detailed picture of how the ancient Egyptians thought about the body, about disease, and about treatment. The most famous of these documents is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, named for the American dealer who purchased it in 1862. It is a surgical text, probably copied in the New Kingdom from an older original, and it describes in methodical, almost clinical language the examination and treatment of various injuries, head wounds, spinal injuries, chest wounds, broken bones. For each case it follows a standard format. Here is the presentation, here is the examination, here is my assessment, here is what can be done. What is remarkable about the Edwin Smith Papyrus is its rationalism. Many ancient medical texts are full of magical incantations and ritual treatments, approaches that assume the cause of disease is supernatural, a demon, an angry god, a malevolent spirit, and therefore require supernatural remedies. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is different. It approaches injury in a systematic, observational way, describes symptoms and signs in precise language, and often distinguishes between cases that are treatable and cases that are not. A disease I will treat, the text says in some cases, a disease I will contend with in others, a disease not to be treated when the case is hopeless. This frank acknowledgement of the limits of medicine, this willingness to say plainly that some conditions cannot be cured, is striking in a text from more than 3,000 years ago. It suggests a tradition of medical observation and practice that was far more rigorous than might be expected. The Ebers Papyrus is different in character. It is more of a medical recipe book, a collection of treatments for a wide variety of conditions, some more plausible than others. It includes treatments for digestive problems, eye diseases, skin conditions, respiratory ailments, and many other things. Some of the treatments make immediate sense. Willow bark is prescribed for pain relief, and willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Honey is used in wound treatments, and honey is genuinely antimicrobial. Garlic is prescribed for various conditions, and garlic has real antibacterial properties. Other treatments are less persuasive to a modern reader. Crocodile dung was recommended for some purposes, and various other substances that seem unlikely to have had the claimed effects. But the important point is the approach, systematic observation, recorded treatments, an attempt to match remedy to condition. The ancient Egyptian doctors were not the primitive witch doctors that popular imagination sometimes paints them as. They were skilled practitioners who had accumulated generations of medical knowledge and who applied that knowledge with care and attention. In a world without modern understanding of germ theory or biochemistry, they did what they could, and what they could do was more than nothing. Medicine in Egypt was also deeply connected to the Nile, in the way that everything in Egypt was connected to the Nile. The parasites that caused bilharzia, a debilitating disease caused by flatworm larvae in Nile water, were endemic in ancient Egypt. An examination of mummies has found evidence of this disease in individuals from many periods of Egyptian history. Malaria was common in the delta, where standing water provided breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Eye infections, caused partly by the dust and sand carried by the wind, were so common that the ancient Egyptians developed a sophisticated range of eye medicines. These were the costs of living in close proximity to a great river in a warm climate. The same water that watered the fields also harboured the parasites. The same soil that grew the grain also harboured the bacteria that could infect wounds. The gifts of the Nile came with burdens attached. Let us think about education more carefully. We have mentioned the scribal schools, the places where the children of the privileged classes learn to read and write. But what was the content of this education? What did Egyptian school children learn? They learned to write first. This involved copying texts, again and again, until the hand could produce the signs automatically and correctly. The texts they copied were not necessarily documents with immediate practical application. They were literary texts, religious texts, wisdom texts, the instruction of Ptah-hotep, the maxims of Ani, the hymn to the Nile. By copying these texts, students absorbed not just the writing system, but the cultural values and intellectual traditions of their civilization. The instruction texts are particularly interesting. These are texts in which an older, wise person gives advice to a younger person, a father to a son, a teacher to a student, an official to a junior colleague. The advice covers a wide range of topics: how to behave in the presence of superiors, how to treat subordinates, how to manage a household, how to conduct yourself in court, how to deal with difficult people, how to be a good husband and father. Much of this advice is recognizable across the centuries. The instruction of Ptah-hotep, which may be the oldest wisdom text in the world, includes advice such as, "Listen to the words of the wise, for great advantages come from following good advice," and "Do not be proud of your knowledge, but discuss it with the ignorant man as well as the learned." The first person who was told to take advice, rather than assuming they knew everything, was probably an ancient Egyptian schoolchild, copying these words from a teacher's model. Mathematics was also part of the scribal education. The Egyptian mathematical tradition, documented in the Rind mathematical papyrus and the Moscow mathematical papyrus, is practical and problem-solving in orientation. It does not deal in abstract theory. There is no equivalent to Euclidean geometry or Pythagorean mathematics in terms of formal proof and deductive reasoning. What it does deal with is the calculation of volumes, areas, slopes, and quantities with considerable sophistication. How much grain does this cylindrical granary hold? How many bricks are needed to build a ramp of these dimensions? If a workforce of this size is assigned to move these stones, how long will the task take? These are the questions that Egyptian mathematics was designed to answer. They are, in every sense, practical questions, the questions of administrators and builders and surveyors. The calculation of the slope of a pyramid face, the sekid in ancient Egyptian, was a standard problem in the mathematical curriculum. How steep should the face be? What angle? How much does it set back for every cubit of height? These were questions that had to be answered correctly before the first stone was laid, and the mathematical tools for answering them were developed and taught and refined over centuries. The legal system of ancient Egypt was, like everything else, organised around the principle of Mut, cosmic justice, the right order of things. Law, in the Egyptian understanding, was not simply the commands of a human ruler, but the expression of divine order. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of Mut, was the ultimate source of legal authority. But in practice, day-to-day legal matters were handled by local courts, by the vizier's court, and by various official bodies at different levels of the administrative hierarchy. The records that survive from the ancient Egyptian legal system reveal a society that took justice seriously, at least in its ideals, if not always in its practice. There are records of court cases involving property disputes, inheritance conflicts, assault, theft, and more serious crimes. There are records of trials, of testimony, of sentences. There are records of appeals to higher authorities when decisions seemed unjust. One of the most remarkable documents from ancient Egypt's legal records is a series of papyri from the village of Deir el-Medina, a community of workers who built and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period. This community, which was unusual in having a particularly high rate of literacy, because its members were all craftspeople of considerable skill who needed to read and write to do their work, left behind an extraordinary archive of documents. From these documents, we know that the workers of Deir el-Medina organised their own local court, called the Kenbet, which handled minor disputes among community members. We know about disputes over who owned a particular donkey, about arguments between neighbours over the boundary of their houses, about accusations of theft of tools or food. We know about a case in which a worker accused another of stealing the linen wrappings from a mummy, a form of grave robbery, but perhaps motivated by the desperate need for cloth rather than by malice. These documents bring ancient Egypt into close, almost uncomfortable proximity. The disputes and anxieties and small injustices of the Deir el-Medina community are not the grand affairs of pharaohs and gods. They are the ordinary human concerns of people living in a small community, who took what from whom, whose fault it was, and what should be done about it. The workers of Deir el-Medina also went on strike. This is documented in another remarkable set of papyri. In the reign of Rameses III, when the grain rations that the workers were supposed to receive were delayed, not delivered on time by the administration, the workers put down their tools and marched out of the Valley of the Kings to sit at the gate of the mortuary temple complex, refusing to work until they were fed. They said, explicitly and simply, "We are hungry and we cannot work without food." This strike was resolved eventually. The rations were delivered. The workers returned to work, but the event, the first recorded labour strike in history, is a reminder that the people at the bottom of the ancient Egyptian social hierarchy were not simply passive cogs in the machinery of the state. They were people with needs and rights, and the capacity to assert those rights when they were violated, even in ancient Egypt, even 3,000 years ago. The women of Deir el-Medina deserve their own moment of attention, because the documents from this community tell us more about the daily life of ordinary Egyptian women than almost any other source from the ancient world. The wives of the tomb workers were not passive figures. The documents record their participation in local legal proceedings, their management of household finances, their engagement in small-scale trade. They borrowed and lent goods, they bought and sold. They brought cases to the local court and had cases brought against them. They wrote letters, or more precisely, they dictated letters, since many of them may not have been fully literate in the way that their scribal husbands were, though some clearly were. The division of labour in these households was fairly typical for ancient Egypt. The men worked at the tombs, the women managed the home. But managing the home was not a minor or passive occupation. It involved acquiring and managing food supplies, which required constant engagement with the local economy, trading surplus goods for things the household needed, judging the fairness of exchanges, negotiating with neighbours and merchants and administrators. Women from Deir el-Medina also appear in legal records as owners of property. They owned portions of houses, shares of livestock, pieces of furniture. They inherited property from their husbands or from their own parents. They could leave property to their own children or to whomever they chose. The legal standing of these women was not that of the utterly propertyless and powerless figures that women occupy in some other ancient legal systems. This is not to idealise the situation. Ancient Egyptian society was patriarchal in its broad structure, and the options available to women in terms of education, of formal power, of public life, were considerably more limited than those available to men of equivalent social class. But the legal and economic standing of women in ancient Egypt was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively strong. The craftspeople of Deir el-Medina. Let us spend a little time with them. They were painters and sculptors, primarily. The artists who decorated the walls of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings with the extraordinary imagery of Egyptian religious and mythological tradition. Their work has survived the millennia because it was done deep inside sealed stone tombs, protected from moisture and light and the slow destruction that befalls most things. The paintings in the Valley of the Kings are among the most remarkable things that human beings have ever made, not because of their grand scale, compared to the great paintings of later periods, They're often relatively small and densely packed. Not because of their technical virtuosity in the modern sense. Egyptian painting uses a flat, schematic style that modern eyes might initially read as naive. But because of their extraordinary vitality, their detail, their care, their sheer commitment to depicting every aspect of the journey of the dead and the world of the gods. The walls of these tombs are covered with texts and images so densely packed that they give an almost overwhelming impression of visual abundance. Every available surface is covered. The ceilings are painted with astronomical maps, the sky of the underworld, the patterns of stars and constellations as the Egyptians conceived them. The walls show the pharaoh being received by the gods, the pharaoh making offerings, the pharaoh navigating the dangers of the underworld, the pharaoh achieving eternal life. The colours are astonishing in their freshness. Deep blue and bright red and clear yellow and fresh green. These are not the muted, faded colours that one might expect from paintings that are 3,000 years old. In the sealed darkness of the tombs, protected from light and moisture and air, the pigments have remained as vivid as the day they were applied. When Howard Carter first opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he was reportedly struck not just by the gold, but by the freshness of the colours. The painters who created these images worked in teams, following established conventions and patterns. Senior painters would sketch the outlines, junior painters would fill in the background colours, specialists would add the detailed hieroglyphic texts. The work was organised with efficiency and precision. Each painter knew their role, their section, their task, and the tools of their work were humble and practical. Brushes made of rush stems, stone palettes for mixing pigments, small bowls of water, pigments ground from minerals, blue from azurite or the manufactured Egyptian blue, red from ochre or red lead, yellow from yellow ochre or orpiment, white from calcite, black from soot. These were not exotic or expensive materials. They were the same materials used by craftspeople throughout the ancient world. The difference was the skill, the tradition, the accumulated knowledge of how to use these materials to create something that would last, something that would be worthy of the divine pharaoh and the gods before whose judgment he stood. The workers who painted these tombs are, in a sense, responsible for much of what we know and feel about ancient Egypt. Without their work, the tombs would be empty chambers. With their work, they are windows into a world that has otherwise vanished. A world of gods and barks and judgment halls and eternal life, rendered in vivid pigment on stone, waiting for the modern world to come and find them. As we continue drifting through the expanded story of Egyptian civilization, let the details accumulate around you like silt settling from floodwater. You do not need to hold each one. Just let them settle. Let us think about trade. Egypt was not isolated. The Nile connected it to the north, to the Mediterranean, to the trading networks of the ancient world, and to the south, to Nubia and beyond, to the resources of sub-Saharan Africa. Egyptian traders and expeditions travelled in many directions, seeking things that Egypt lacked and offering things that Egypt had in abundance. What Egypt had in abundance, grain in enormous quantities, the surplus of the Nile flood. Linen, the finest textile in the ancient world. Gold from the Nubian mines. Papyrus, the writing material on which much of the ancient world's record-keeping was done. Natron, a naturally occurring salt used in mummification and in various manufacturing processes. What Egypt needed, cedar wood from Lebanon, for building the large ships and architectural elements that required timber of a length and quality that Egyptian trees could not provide. Silver, which was rarer in Egypt than gold. Copper, from the mines of the Sinai. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue semi-precious stone that was used extensively in Egyptian jewellery and decoration. It came from what is now Afghanistan, travelling through multiple intermediaries before reaching Egypt. Incense, frankincense and myrrh, from the land of Punt, which was somewhere in the region of the modern Horn of Africa. The expeditions to Punt were famous in ancient Egypt. The most well-documented is the expedition sent by the pharaoh Hatshepsut, recorded in relief carvings at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The relief shows the Egyptian ships arriving in Punt, the exchange of goods, the exotic animals, a live giraffe, baboons, cattle with distinctive dewlaps, being loaded onto the ships for transport back to Egypt. The Egyptians are clearly thrilled by the strangeness of Punt. The houses built on stilts over the water, the unusual appearance of the Puntite people, the exotic trees that could be transplanted to Egypt. These expeditions to Punt were not primarily military ventures. They were trading expeditions, commercial in nature though backed by the authority of the state. The pharaoh sent ships, and the ships came back laden with incense and ebony and ivory and gold and live animals for the royal menageries. The pharaoh was the great merchant in a sense, the organiser of the trading system that kept Egypt connected to the wider world. The merchants who conducted day-to-day trade in the towns and cities of Egypt operated within a system that did not use money in the modern sense. There were no coins in Egypt until the late period, when the influence of Greek trade practices began to make themselves felt. Instead, trade was conducted by barter, by the exchange of goods of equivalent value. But this barter was not simply a case of someone offering a jar of grain in exchange for a pair of sandals. There was a system of standard values expressed in weights of copper or grain that allowed the value of different goods to be compared. A deban of copper, a deban being a standard unit of weight, was worth a specific number of grain hekats. A linen garment of a certain quality was worth a certain number of deban of copper. This was not a monetary system, but it functioned as a reference system that made complex exchanges possible. In the markets of Egyptian towns, goods were spread on mats and exchanged in busy, noisy, colourful scenes. Farmers brought their surplus grain and produce. Craftspeople brought their pottery, their linen, their woodwork. Everyone was looking for what they needed, offering what they had to trade. The negotiation was vigorous, probably loud, certainly accompanied by firm opinions about the value of what was being exchanged. These markets were also places of social exchange, places where news was shared, where gossip was transmitted, where people who lived in different parts of the community came together. The market was not just economic, it was social, communicative, alive. The Nile was the market's highway. Goods moved along the river constantly, in all directions, in boats of all sizes. The great cargo boats carrying grain or stone or cattle or soldiers. The smaller trading boats carrying pottery and cloth and fish, and all the small necessities of daily life. The reed boats of local fishermen, the official boats of government administrators travelling to inspect the provinces. River traffic on the Nile must have been extraordinarily busy during the most active periods of Egyptian history. There were no alternative routes of significance, no roads for wheeled traffic, no overland routes that could compete with the efficiency and capacity of river transport. Everything that moved over any significant distance in Egypt moved by boat on the Nile. The boat builders of ancient Egypt were, accordingly, among the most important craftspeople in the country. They worked in the boatyards along the river, transforming imported cedar and local acacia into the vessels that held the country together. The techniques of Egyptian boat building are known to us from surviving remains. The oldest known planked boats in the world, the Abydos boats, date from around 5,000 years ago, and from the countless depictions of boats in Egyptian art. Egyptian boats evolved considerably over the long span of the civilization. The earliest boats were simple reed vessels. Later, planked wooden boats of various types were developed, including specialised cargo vessels with wide, shallow hulls designed for maximum carrying capacity in the relatively shallow and slow-moving Nile. Sailing vessels with large square sails were used when the wind was favourable. When it was not, rowing was the alternative. A crew of rowers working in the heat of the Egyptian sun is a demanding and exhausting occupation. The oarsmen of Egyptian boats are depicted in tomb paintings working in rhythm, all oars entering the water together, all pulling together, all lifting together, guided by a rhythmic chant or by the sound of a drum. This synchronized effort was not just efficient. It was a form of coordination that required practice and discipline, the kind of discipline that was necessary for the many collective tasks of Egyptian civilization. Rowing, ploughing, winnowing, grinding grain, weaving. These were the repetitive physical rhythms that underlay the civilization. They sound the same when you describe them. Reach and pull, forward and back. The rhythm of work, any work, the rhythm of the body doing what it has been asked to do over and over until it is done. Let us think for a moment about the river at night. In the ancient world before electric light, darkness was real. Not the slightly dim darkness of a modern night in a city, where there is always some ambient light, a street lamp, the glow of windows, the orange sky of light pollution. Real darkness. The darkness in which the stars are brilliantly visible, in which the Milky Way is a broad, luminous band across the sky, in which the shape of a tree or a house is barely visible at any distance. In this darkness, the Nile glowed. This sounds fanciful, but it is true. The surface of the Nile at night, under a clear sky full of stars, would have caught and reflected the starlight, the moonlight, and would have been a lighter, slightly luminous presence in the surrounding darkness. The sound of the river, constant, gentle, everywhere along the valley, was both a familiar companion and a slight, inescapable reminder of the river's perpetual presence. The ancient Egyptians navigated the Nile at night. Boats with cargo to deliver, or officials travelling under time pressure would move after dark, guided by the stars and by the knowledge of the river's channel and its dangers that experienced pilots accumulated over years of practice. Night navigation on the Nile was not preferred, but it was done. The stars that guided these nocturnal river travellers were the same stars that guided the religious calendar, the same stars that the priests observed from the rooftops of the temples, the same stars that were painted on the ceilings of the royal tombs as the celestial landscape of the afterlife. Astronomy in ancient Egypt was primarily practical and religious. It was not the deductive, theoretical astronomy of the Greeks. But the observation of the stars was sophisticated and continuous, carried on from generation to generation, and the knowledge accumulated was considerable. The Egyptians tracked the movements of the planets, which they called the stars that know no rest. They observed the phases of the moon and incorporated them into their calendar. They noted the heliacal risings of important stars, the moment when a star first becomes visible above the eastern horizon, just before sunrise after a period of invisibility, and used these as calendar markers. The sky was, in a sense, another nilometer, another instrument for reading the future, for determining the time of year, for anchoring the endless cycle of agricultural and religious life in the larger cycle of the cosmos. Everything in ancient Egypt was part of a cycle. The day and the night, the flood and the drought, the planting and the harvest, the life and the death, the cycle of the stars, and at the centre of all these interlocking cycles, giving them their rhythm and their meaning, was the Nile. Always the Nile. Always running, always returning, always renewing. We are still here. The voice is still here. The night, wherever you are, is continuing its quiet work. You might wonder, as you drift through this story of the Nile and the civilization it nourished, whether other rivers, other places in the world, gave rise to similar patterns, whether the annual cycle of flood and fertility, of water and grain and administration, was something unique to Egypt or something that happened in other places too. It happened in other places too. And the similarities, when you look at them, are striking enough to be worth exploring. But so are the differences, because each river has its own character, and the civilizations that grew up alongside rivers each took on the character of their particular river in ways that are subtle and profound. Let us travel a little. Let us see what the Nile, viewed in comparison, reveals about itself. We go east. We go to the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. The word is Greek, meaning land between the rivers, and the rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates, two great rivers that rise in the mountains of eastern Anatolia and flow southeastward through what is now Iraq, eventually joining and emptying into the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamia was the other great river civilization of the ancient world, and it was, in many ways, a direct contemporary of ancient Egypt. The earliest Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, were founded around the same time as the earliest Egyptian settlements, and both civilizations developed writing at roughly similar periods, though independently and in different forms. But the Tigris and Euphrates are very different rivers from the Nile, and their behaviour shaped Mesopotamian civilization differently. The Tigris and Euphrates also flood, but their flooding is irregular, unpredictable, sometimes violent. The floods of Mesopotamia do not always come at the same time of year. They can come too early or too late or not at all. They can be gentle or catastrophic. In some years, the rivers flood destructively, sweeping away cities and drowning fields. In other years, the floods are insufficient to adequately water the land. The Mesopotamians, living with this unpredictable and sometimes violent river system, developed a more anxious relationship with nature than the Egyptians. Their gods were more demanding, more capricious, more easily angered. Their religious texts include lengthy laments for the destruction caused by floods, for cities swept away and populations scattered. The Great Flood myth, the story of a world-destroying deluge that appears in Mesopotamian literature as the flood of Utnapishtim, and in the Bible as the story of Noah, originated in this region, where genuinely catastrophic floods were a real possibility. Compare this to Egypt. Egyptian religious texts rarely dwell on the destructive potential of the flood. The flood is generally celebrated, welcomed, thanked. It is the gift of happy, the benevolence of the river. This is not because the Egyptians were naive. They knew perfectly well that an excessively high flood could be damaging. But their experience of the river was fundamentally different. The Nile's flood, unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, was reliable. It came every year within a predictable range at a predictable time. You could plan for it. You could organise your calendar around it. This reliability gave the Egyptians something that the Mesopotamians, in their more volatile river environment, had a harder time achieving. A sense that the world was basically ordered, basically benevolent, basically trustworthy. The Egyptians believed in Maat, cosmic order, as a genuine reality, something that the gods maintained and that the pharaoh upheld. The Mesopotamians, living with more chaotic natural forces, had a harder time sustaining that belief. This is a generalization, of course. Mesopotamian civilization was complex and varied, and there were certainly periods of confidence and prosperity and religious serenity. And Egyptian history had its catastrophes, periods when the flood failed repeatedly, when famine spread across the country, when the social order broke down. But as a broad characterization, it holds. Egypt's river gave Egyptians a more stable, more optimistic relationship with the natural world than the rivers of Mesopotamia gave to the people who lived between them. the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia were also different from those of Egypt, and this difference had important political consequences. In Egypt, basin irrigation, the system of earthwork walls that captured the flood and directed it to the fields, was relatively simple, and it could be managed at the local level. A nome, a village, a group of farmers could maintain their own irrigation system without necessarily requiring the coordination of a powerful central state. The central state provided benefits: roads, temples, military protection, administrative coordination, but the basic agricultural work could continue even when central authority was weak. In Mesopotamia, the situation was more complicated. The rivers had to be tamed more aggressively because their behaviour was less predictable. Canal systems, long channels that diverted water from the rivers and carried it to fields many miles away, were necessary, and maintaining these canal systems required coordination at a regional or state level. If the canals silted up or fell into disrepair, entire agricultural regions could become unproductive. The maintenance of the irrigation infrastructure was, in a very direct sense, the maintenance of civilization itself. This meant that strong central authority was even more necessary in Mesopotamia than in Egypt, at least for the maintenance of agricultural productivity. The kings of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon were, in part, canal builders and canal maintainers, responsible for the physical infrastructure that kept their kingdoms alive. There is a famous inscription from a Mesopotamian king, Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, who is famous for his law code, in which he boasts of the canals he has dug and the irrigation systems he has maintained. For a modern reader, this might seem like an odd thing to boast about, but in the context of ancient Mesopotamia, a king who built a great canal was a king who had created life, who had turned desert into farmland, who had fed his people. It was the practical equivalent of a pharaoh building a great temple, a demonstration of power and virtue expressed in stone and water. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia, in their different ways, understood that civilization was fundamentally a water management project. Now let us go further east, to India, to the valley of the Indus River. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after the city of Harappa where it was first excavated, flourished from about 3300 to 1300 BCE, roughly contemporary with much of ancient Egypt and early Mesopotamia. It extended across a large area of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, centred on the Indus River and its tributaries. The Indus River also floods. In fact, its flooding patterns are determined by the same monsoon system that drives the summer rains in Ethiopia, and thus, indirectly, the flooding of the Nile. The monsoon rains that fall over the mountains and plains of South Asia fill the Indus and its tributaries and cause them to flood each summer, depositing silt and renewing the soil in much the same way as the Nile does. The cities of the Indus Valley Civilization are remarkable. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are the largest and most famous, but there were many others, spread across an enormous area. These cities were built on a grid plan, straight streets intersecting at right angles, a level of urban planning that was not matched in Europe until centuries later. They had sophisticated drainage systems, covered drains running beneath the streets, connected to individual houses carrying wastewater away from the city. They had public baths, storehouses, and what appear to be administrative buildings. We know relatively little about the Indus Valley Civilization compared to what we know about ancient Egypt, because their script, the Indus script, has not been deciphered. We have thousands of small seals and tablets covered in Indus script characters, but we cannot read them. We can describe the civilization's cities and its artifacts, but we cannot hear its voice the way we can hear the voice of ancient Egypt through its surviving texts. What we can say is that the Indus Valley Civilization, like Egypt, was organised around a river and its annual flood. The cities were built in locations that allowed access to the river for irrigation and transport, but at sufficient elevation to avoid the worst of the flooding. The agricultural system was based on the flood-watered fields of the Indus Plain, growing wheat and barley. The same crops as in Egypt. The civilization declined around 1900 BCE, and its decline has been attributed in part to changes in the monsoon pattern, a drying trend that reduced the reliability of the Indus flood, disrupting the agricultural system that the civilization depended on. This is a sobering parallel to Egyptian history. The thing that made these civilizations possible was also the thing that could unmake them. When the river changed its behaviour, when the flood became less reliable or less generous or changed its course, the civilization that depended on it was vulnerable in ways that no amount of military power or administrative sophistication could entirely compensate for. Let us go east again, further east to China. The Yellow River, the Huanghe, is one of the great rivers of East Asia. It rises in the highlands of western China and flows eastward to the Yellow Sea, passing through the Loess plateaus of northern China, where it carries enormous quantities of yellow silt, the colour that gives the river its name and that gives the sea into which it empties its name. The Yellow River is in some ways the most dramatic of all the great agricultural rivers. It floods with enormous frequency and sometimes with catastrophic force. Its tendency to change course dramatically. At various points in history it has emptied into the sea hundreds of kilometres from its current mouth after particularly catastrophic floods, has earned it the name China's Sorrow. And yet, around this difficult and dangerous river, Chinese civilization developed. The ancient states of the Yellow River Basin, the Shang dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, the Xin dynasty, built their civilization on the rich agricultural land of the Yellow River Plain, irrigating with the river's water and fertilizing with its silt. The relationship between Chinese civilization and the Yellow River was, if anything, more fraught than the relationship between Egypt and the Nile. The Yellow River's floods were genuinely catastrophic on a regular basis. Managing the river, building and maintaining the dikes and levees that tried to contain it within its banks, was a constant imperial preoccupation. It has been said that the Yellow River made the Chinese emperor because the coordination required to manage the river demanded the kind of centralized authority that only an emperor could provide. This is the hydraulic theory of civilization, proposed by the historian Karl Wittfogel in the mid-20th century. The idea that large-scale irrigation and water management systems necessarily require and produce authoritarian, centralized states. Wittfogel's theory has been criticized on many grounds, and it is certainly too simple as a universal explanation. But it contains a kernel of truth that the examples of Egypt, Mesopotamia and China all illustrate in different ways. Water management is hard. It requires coordination across large areas. It requires the ability to mobilize large numbers of workers. It requires the maintenance of complex infrastructure over long periods of time. These are things that individual farmers or villagers cannot do alone. They require some form of coordinated authority, whether that authority is a pharaoh, a king, an emperor, or some other form of political organization. The river makes civilization, and civilization makes the state, and the state makes the river manageable, or tries to. The Ganges, the Mekong, the Nile's tributaries, the Amazon, rivers, all of them, that have shaped the human communities living on their banks, that have determined the rhythm of agricultural life, that have provided the material foundation for complex societies. But none of these rivers, not the Tigris and Euphrates, not the Indus, not the Yellow River, has the quality that makes the Nile so extraordinary and so specifically enabling of the kind of civilization that Egypt developed. the predictability. The Nile's annual flood is, by the standards of other great rivers, remarkably reliable. It comes at roughly the same time every year. The variation from year to year is real, but it is variation within a relatively narrow range. The flood does not happen in March one year and November the next. It does not skip years entirely. It does not suddenly change course and destroy cities that have been in the same place for centuries. The Nile floods in summer and recedes in autumn. Every year, year after year. For millions of years before human beings arrived, and for thousands of years after. This reliability is what allowed the Egyptian calendar to be organised around the flood. It is what allowed the scribes to predict, within a reasonable margin, what the harvest would be based on the Nilometer readings. It is what allowed the granary system to function. You could calculate how much to keep in reserve because you had a reasonable idea of what the next harvest would bring. It is what allowed the Egyptian state to be stable over such an extraordinarily long period. You cannot have 3,000 years of recognisable cultural continuity if your river is constantly destroying your cities or failing to water your fields. The Nile's reliability was the foundational gift that made all of Egyptian civilization possible. Other river civilizations had their own gifts and their own challenges, but the gift of the Nile was one that few other rivers could match. Now let us explore one more comparison, one that brings us back to Egypt but looks at it from a different angle. The Nile does not just flow through Egypt, it flows through multiple countries in what is now northeastern Africa, from its distant sources in Uganda and Ethiopia and Rwanda all the way to the Mediterranean. And the relationship between Egypt and the Upper Nile, the regions that control the sources of the flood, is one that has been politically significant for much of Egyptian history. Nubia, as we have noted, was the land immediately to the south of Egypt, but south of Nubia, the Nile reaches its origins in what is now Sudan and Ethiopia and Uganda. The cultures and kingdoms of these regions, which have their own rich histories, were connected to Egypt through the river, sometimes in trade, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in a complex mixture of both. The kingdom of Kush, which rose to prominence in the region south of the Third Cataract around 3,000 years ago, was deeply influenced by Egyptian culture, so deeply that the Kushite kings eventually adopted Egyptian religious practices, built Egyptian-style pyramids, wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and, in the 8th century BCE, conquered Egypt itself and established the 25th dynasty, which ruled Egypt for roughly a century. The Nubian pharaohs, Kashta, Pianki, also called Piye, Shabaka, Tahaka, were, in some ways, more Egyptian than the Egyptians. They built pyramids when the Egyptians had stopped building pyramids. They restored temples that Egyptian rulers had neglected. They presented themselves as the restorers of true Egyptian religious practice. Their enthusiasm for Egyptian culture was genuine, born of centuries of close cultural contact, and their reign produced some remarkable art and architecture. Tahaka, in particular, is a fascinating figure. He ruled Egypt and Kush for most of the 7th century BCE, and he was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkable ruler. Ambitious, building-obsessed, politically skilled. He appears in the Bible as Tirhaka, king of Ethiopia, where he is mentioned as an ally of the kingdom of Judah against the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The Assyrian threat to Egypt was real and serious. The Assyrian Empire, based in what is now Iraq, was the most militarily powerful state in the ancient world in the 7th century BCE, and it eventually conquered and sacked Memphis, driving the Kushite pharaohs back to their southern kingdoms. The brief Kushite period in Egyptian history ended, and Egypt came under Assyrian influence. This is a reminder that Egyptian civilization, for all its stability, was not immune to the pressures of the outside world. Egypt was conquered, or influenced by foreign powers at various points in its long history, by the Hyksos, a people from the Levant who ruled the Delta during the Second Intermediate Period, by the Assyrians, by the Persians, ultimately by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and then by the Romans. Each conquering power recognised, as they had to, the fundamental importance of the Nile. The Persians, who conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, did not try to change Egyptian agriculture or replace the irrigation systems. They simply took over the administrative structure that already existed and inserted themselves at the top. The Ptolemies, the dynasty of Greek-speaking kings that Alexander's general Ptolemy founded, did the same and added to it. They were enthusiastic builders of temples, sponsors of the agricultural system, rulers who understood that their wealth came from the Nile, and that keeping the Nile's farmers productive was the first priority of government. The last of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra, the Cleopatra of Shakespeare and Hollywood and popular imagination. She was, in many ways, a remarkable and sophisticated ruler, the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. Her predecessors had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries without bothering. A skilled diplomat, a person of considerable intelligence and political ability. Her fate, her alliance with Julius Caesar, her relationship with Mark Antony, her eventual defeat by Octavian, the future Augustus Caesar, and her suicide in 30 BCE, mark the end of Egyptian independence and the beginning of the Roman province of Aegyptus. But even under Rome, the Nile remained central. Egypt under Rome was one of the most important provinces of the empire, primarily because of its agricultural productivity. The Roman grain supply, the supply of grain that fed the population of Rome and was distributed free or at subsidized prices to Roman citizens, depended substantially on Egyptian grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and the breadbasket of Egypt was the Nile. The emperor kept close control of Egypt, unusually close by Roman standards, because the Nile Valley was so critical to the empire's food supply that losing control of it, or allowing it to fall into the hands of a rival, could be catastrophic. Egypt was, in a sense, too valuable to trust to a regular senator as governor. It was administered directly by a prefect appointed by and accountable directly to the emperor. And so the story of the Nile as the foundation of civilization continued, even as the civilization sitting on top of it changed from Egyptian to Hellenistic to Roman. The flood still came, the fields were still planted, the grain still grew, only the names of the rulers changed. There is a particular quality to the late afternoon light on the Nile that travellers have remarked on for centuries. The light in Egypt is unlike light in other places. It is very clear, very direct, with a quality of precise illumination that makes distant objects seem close and everything seem very sharply defined. The shadows are dense and blue-black, in strong contrast to the brilliant brightness of the sunlit surfaces. The sky has a deep, saturated colour that painters have struggled to capture. This quality of light is one of the reasons Egyptian art looks the way it does. Egyptian painting uses strong, clear colours, deep blue, bright red, warm yellow, fresh green, without modulation or shadow, because in the Egyptian light shadows fall sharply and completely, and the sunlit surfaces are almost uniformly bright. It is a painting style that reflects what Egyptian eyes actually saw. In the late afternoon, the light turns golden, and the Nile reflects it back from its surface, the water becoming a sheet of beaten gold that gradually softens to orange and then pink as the sun approaches the western cliffs. The shadows of the cliffs on the west bank stretch across the river, cool and dark, while the east bank is still in full light. And then the sun is gone, and the sky deepens through layers of colour, and the first stars appear, and the Nile becomes dark and silver, reflecting the stars and the rising moon. This has been happening every evening for millions of years. The same river, the same light, the same progression from gold to pink to purple to black. The farmers who planted their fields 3,000 years ago watched this same light. The pyramid builders who rested at the end of their shifts watched this same sky. The priests who performed their rituals at sunset watched the same colours fade over the same western cliffs. There is a continuity in that, a quiet, almost consoling continuity. The world changes, civilizations rise and fall. Pharaohs are born and die and are mummified and buried and forgotten and rediscovered and studied and debated. But the light on the Nile in the late afternoon is the same, and the river continues. Let us stay in Egypt a little longer before we visit other rivers. The late period of ancient Egypt, the centuries between roughly 664 BCE and the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, is sometimes treated as a footnote, a period of decline, a postscript to the grand narrative of the Old, Middle and New Kingdoms. This is not entirely fair. The late period was a time of genuine political complexity. Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians, then liberated by a series of native dynasties, then conquered by the Persians under Cambyses in 525 BCE. There were periods when Egypt was ruled by Egyptian-born pharaohs, and periods when it was a province of the Persian Empire. There were native revolts against Persian rule, some successful, some not. Egypt was a prize that every great power of the ancient Near East wanted. And through all of this, Egyptian civilization continued. The temples were maintained, the religious calendar was observed, the scribes kept their records, the farmers farmed their fields, the Nile flooded, the grain grew. This persistence is itself remarkable. A civilization that can survive conquest, that can absorb foreign rulers and continue its essential practices, has a depth and resilience that goes beyond political institutions. Egyptian civilization was not simply a set of political arrangements that could be dismantled when the political arrangements changed. It was a way of life, embedded in the daily practices of millions of people, rooted in the landscape and the river in a way that no conquering army could simply uproot. The Persian rulers of Egypt learned this. The most successful of them, Darius I in particular, adopted Egyptian royal titles, performed Egyptian religious rituals, built in the Egyptian style. They presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects not as foreign conquerors imposing an alien culture, but as pharaohs, legitimate rulers in the ancient tradition, upholders of Maat. This was not simply cynical manipulation, though it was certainly politically convenient. The Persian rulers genuinely recognized that Egypt had a culture of extraordinary depth and sophistication, one that deserved respect. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote extensively about Egyptian history and customs, and expressed deep admiration for Egyptian civilization, which he regarded as the oldest and in many ways the most accomplished in the world. Herodotus, in fact, is one of our most important sources for understanding what ancient Egypt looked like during a period when it was still a living, functioning civilization. He describes the temples, the priests, the nilometers, the festivals, the crops, the customs of the people. He's not always accurate. He was a traveller in a foreign country, dependent on interpreters and informants, and he sometimes records myths and misunderstandings alongside accurate observation. But he gives us a sense of the texture of the place, the feel of it, the colour and sound and smell of Egypt in the 5th century BCE. What Herodotus noticed most of all was the river. He described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, a phrase that has been quoted ever since, and that captures something essential. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. The entire civilization, everything that Herodotus found so impressive and so admirable was the gift of the annual flood. He noticed the strange inversion of the Nile Valley, how in most countries rivers flow down from highlands and are swollen by rain, while the Nile does the opposite, rising in summer when there is no rain in Egypt itself, flowing north toward the sea. He speculated, as his informants had, about what caused the flood. He proposed various theories, none of which were correct, because the sources of the Nile, the Ethiopian highlands, the Great Lakes of Central Africa, were unknown to the Greek world of his time. But he observed the flood with the careful attention of someone who understood its importance, who could see in the rise and fall of the river the heartbeat of the civilization he was visiting. The Ptolemaic period, the period of Greek-speaking pharaohs after Alexander's conquest, was in many ways a time of extraordinary cultural creativity. Alexandria, the city that Alexander founded at the western edge of the Nile Delta, became one of the intellectual centres of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, about which much has been written and mythologized, was a genuine institution of learning, the largest collection of written texts in the ancient world, a place where scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study and argue and write. The scholars of Alexandria worked on problems in mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, literature, and many other fields. Euclid wrote his Elements at Alexandria, the foundational text of Western geometry, studied in slightly modified form by schoolchildren into the modern era. Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using the difference in the angle of shadows at different latitudes on the same day. Hipparchus catalogued the stars. Archimedes, though based in Syracuse rather than Alexandria, was in intellectual dialogue with Alexandrian scholars. And yet even in this Greek intellectual world, the Nile retained its central place. The scholars of Alexandria studied the Nile. They wanted to understand its source, which remained mysterious. They measured its flow. They calculated the timing of the flood. The river that had mystified and fascinated the Egyptians for thousands of years now fascinated the Greeks who had settled on its banks, and they brought to the old mystery their own intellectual tools and frameworks. The question of the Nile's source. Why did the river flood in summer? Where did the water come from? Remained one of the great unsolved puzzles of the ancient world. Various theories were proposed. Snowmelt from distant mountains, rains in unknown lands, the action of underground springs. Nero, the Roman emperor, apparently sent an expedition up the Nile to find its source. The expedition reached the Sud, the vast swamp in what is now South Sudan, and could go no further. The source of the Nile was not finally established by European explorers until the 19th century. The mystery was part of the Nile's character, part of its power over the imagination. A river that appears from nowhere, that floods for reasons no one can explain, that carries silt from mountains no one has seen. Such a river invites wonder. The ancient Egyptians channeled that wonder into religion, into hymns and prayers. The Greeks channeled it into philosophy and investigation, but they all felt it. Let us return to the other rivers for a moment, because there are some comparisons we have not yet made. The Niger River in West Africa, the Congo, the Zambezi. These rivers have not historically given rise to civilizations as densely documented and archaeologically visible as those of the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates, but they have sustained complex human societies for thousands of years, and their relationship to those societies shares some features with the Nile's relationship to Egypt. The Niger River, particularly in its inland delta region, a large area in what is now Mali where the river spreads out into a complex of channels and lakes, was the centre of one of the great trading civilizations of medieval West Africa. The Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire, which rose and fell between roughly the 9th and 16th centuries CE, were river civilizations in an important sense. The Niger provided water, fish, transportation, and the agricultural foundation for these empires, and the cities that grew along the Niger, Djenné, Timbuktu, Gao, were among the most important urban centres in the medieval world. Timbuktu, at its peak in the 15th and 16th centuries, was a city of scholars and merchants, a centre of Islamic learning where manuscripts were produced and collected in enormous numbers. Many of these manuscripts survive. Hundreds of thousands of them are held in private libraries in Timbuktu and in the institutions of neighbouring countries. They cover subjects ranging from theology and law to astronomy and mathematics and history and medicine. The production of all these manuscripts depended ultimately on the Niger. The agricultural surplus that fed the scholars, the trade routes along the river that brought wealth to the city, the water that sustained the population, all of this was the gift of the Niger, in a way that parallels, at a smaller and a more local scale, the gift of the Nile to Egypt. Rivers make civilization. They provide water, food, transportation, and the means of organising complex societies. This is true not just in Egypt and Mesopotamia and India and China, but wherever rivers flow through landscapes capable of supporting dense human populations. The particular character of the Nile, as we have established, was its extraordinary reliability. But there is another quality worth noting, its direction. The Nile flows north. This sounds obvious, but it is worth remarking on, because most of the world's great rivers flow in a different direction relative to the prevailing wind patterns of their region. In Egypt, the prevailing wind is from the north, from the Mediterranean. This means that travelling south against the current is aided by the wind. A sailboat can simply raise its sail and be pushed upstream, and travelling north with the current does not require a sail at all. This gave the Egyptians what was, in the ancient world, an unusually good transportation system. You could sail in either direction with relative ease. You could move goods, people, armies, building materials up and down the length of the country without the enormous effort that river travel required in many other parts of the world. The hieroglyphs for north and south were, as we have noted, derived from this fact. South was upstream, the direction against the current, the direction of the sail. North was downstream, the direction with the current, the direction of the oar. This conflation of direction with method of travel reflects how completely the river organised Egyptian spatial understanding. To an ancient Egyptian, north meant downstream, meant toward the delta, meant toward the Mediterranean, meant toward the world beyond Egypt. South meant upstream, meant toward Nubia, meant toward the source of the river, meant toward the place from which the flood came. East was the direction of the rising sun, of life, of the land of the living. West was the direction of the setting sun, of death, of the land of the dead. These were not arbitrary associations. They were derived from the specific physical geography of the Nile Valley, from the specific pattern of the river's flow, the sun's arc, the wind's direction. The Egyptian cosmological map was the map of the Nile Valley writ large. The late period of Egypt ended with the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. Alexander did not come as a conqueror in the aggressive, destructive sense. He came, at least in the Egyptian narrative, as a liberator from Persian rule, and he was welcomed accordingly. He visited the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, deep in the western desert, and received a divine affirmation of his role. Some sources say the oracle declared him to be the son of Amun, the Egyptian equivalent of calling him the son of Zeus. He founded Alexandria. He appointed governors. He departed almost immediately for his further conquests in the east, and he never returned to Egypt. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, after conquering an empire stretching from Greece to northwestern India. His general Ptolemy took control of Egypt after Alexander's death, and Ptolemy's descendants, the Ptolemaic dynasty, ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, until the suicide of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE and the annexation of Egypt by Rome. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, was an extraordinary figure by any standard, and she deserves more than a passing mention. She was, first, a scholar. She reportedly spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, the first of her dynasty to bother learning the language of the country they ruled. This linguistic ability was politically significant. It meant she could speak directly to Egyptian priests, to her people, without interpreters, in the language in which they worshipped and thought and dreamed. She was also a politician of exceptional skill, navigating the extraordinarily difficult terrain of the late Roman Republic, where Egypt's fate was bound up with the struggles between Caesar, Pompey, Antony, and Octavian. Her alliance with Julius Caesar, and later with Mark Antony, was not simply romantic. It was strategic, an attempt to maintain Egyptian independence in a world where Rome was consuming everything around it. She failed, ultimately. Rome was too powerful, and the victory of Octavian over Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE sealed Egypt's fate as a Roman province. When it became clear that she would be displayed as a captive in Octavian's triumph in Rome, she chose death, according to the tradition, by the bite of an asp, the Egyptian cobra, the royal serpent that decorated the crowns of the pharaohs. There is a poetry in that choice, if the tradition is accurate. The last pharaoh of Egypt dying by the royal snake, the snake of divine authority, the snake that had crowned the heads of her predecessors for 3,000 years. It is the kind of ending that history sometimes produces, as if the past is trying to make a final statement before the door closes. And then Egypt was Roman, and the Nile continued to flood, and the grain continued to grow, and the scribes, now writing in Greek as much as in Demotic Egyptian, in the period's bilingual administrative world, continued to record the measurements of the nilometer and the quantities of grain in the storehouses. The river did not care who was pharaoh. The Roman period in Egypt is in some ways the most thoroughly documented of all the periods of Egyptian history, because the Romans had an administrative apparatus that produced enormous quantities of written records, and many of these records survive in the dry Egyptian climate that preserves papyrus so well. From the Roman papyri of Egypt, we can construct a remarkably detailed picture of daily life in Roman period Egypt. We have tax receipts, lease agreements, marriage contracts, letters between ordinary people, petitions to local officials, court records. We have enough material to write, in principle, a detailed account of the daily life of any number of ordinary people in Roman Egypt. What these documents reveal above all is continuity. The people of Roman period Egypt, farmers, craftspeople, merchants, administrators, lived in ways that were recognisably similar to the ways their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. They farmed the Nile Valley. They depended on the annual flood. They managed their irrigation systems. They paid their taxes in grain. The names changed. The language of administration changed. Greek replaced Demotic Egyptian as the official language, and Latin was used for certain legal purposes. The gods changed somewhat, with Roman and Greek deities joining the Egyptian pantheon in a complex religious synthesis. The coins looked different, but the rhythm of the place, the flood, the planting, the harvest, the waiting, that did not change. The Nile continued to define the year, the calendar, the basic structure of agricultural and social life. Egypt was still Egypt in all the ways that mattered most, and the Nilometer readings were still taken and still recorded. and still transmitted to the appropriate authorities, because the appropriate authorities, even if they were now Roman officials rather than Egyptian viziers, still needed to know how high the flood had been, because everything still depended on that. We are very deep in the night now, or at least it feels that way, the way time softens at the edges when you are relaxed, when the distinction between now and then becomes gentle and vague, when the voice is just a sound among the other quiet sounds of wherever you are. This final part of the story is the slowest, the most repetitive, the most detailed in very small ways. This is the part where we follow the ordinary day, the unremarkable day, the day of a farmer in ancient Egypt that is almost exactly the same as the day before it and the day after it. A day that's not historic, not memorable, not the kind of day that gets recorded in texts or commemorated on temple walls. Just a day of warmth and water and quiet work and small sounds, and the river always present in the background, always running, always there. Let yourself drift into this day. Let the details wash over you without requiring you to hold them. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to understand it. You just need to let it be there, around you, like the sound of rain. The sun rises. It rises every morning in Egypt with a kind of precision that is almost theatrical. One moment the horizon is dark, and then it brightens to pale gold, and then the edge of the sun appears, and then it is up, and the whole landscape is lit. There is very little of the long, slow dawns that people in northern latitudes experience. In Egypt, the transition from night to day is relatively quick, even at the equinoxes. The farmer wakes at or before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because the body learns the rhythm of the place. After enough years of waking at sunrise, you simply wake at sunrise. The body knows. The house is cool in the early morning. The thick mud brick walls have absorbed the heat of the previous day and radiated it away through the night, and the interior of the house is noticeably cooler than the air outside will be in a few hours. The farmer lies on his sleeping mat, a woven reed mat on a low wooden bed frame, for a moment before rising. The sleeping mat. Let us think about the sleeping mat. It is made of reeds, cut from the banks of the Nile and woven into a flat surface, sometimes with additional padding of dried grass or linen. The texture is slightly rough but not unpleasant. It is light, easy to roll up and move, easy to replace when it wears out. There are sleeping mats depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings, carried by servants, laid out in orderly rows in scenes of domestic life. They are modest objects, but they were present in every household. The farmer sits up from his mat. The house is quiet except for the sound of a child breathing somewhere nearby, the occasional sound of an animal outside. He's thirsty. In the dry Egyptian night, the body loses water through respiration, and waking up thirsty is normal. He drinks from a clay cup that was filled the previous evening and left covered with a flat piece of pottery to keep insects out. The water has been sitting overnight in the cool clay cup, and it is slightly earthy in taste. Not unpleasant, but very distinctly the taste of the Nile, filtered through the clay of the vessel, which is itself made from the river's mud. Everything in Egypt in this sense tastes faintly of the Nile. The bread tastes of the grain that grew in Nile silt. The beer tastes of the barley that grew in the same. The water is the river itself. He puts on his kilt, a length of white linen wrapped around the waist and secured with a belt or by folding. For a farmer, this is essentially the whole outfit. In winter, he might add a rough linen wrap for warmth. In summer, the kilt alone, or sometimes nothing at all for certain tasks. Linen is the fabric of Egypt, made from the flax that grows in the flood-watered fields, spun and woven by the women of the household. He goes outside. The morning air is still and cool. The sky overhead is pale, not yet fully blue. To the east, the sun is about to rise. To the west, the cliffs of the valley are dark against a sky that is still slightly purple with the last of the night. The village is beginning to wake. A few other men are moving, heading to their fields or to the river's edge. A donkey somewhere is being loaded. Chickens, though in early periods of Egyptian history they were less common than they would later become, pick at the ground. The farmer walks to his field. It is not far. In a village of this size, the fields are close, within a few minutes' walk. He walks along the edge of the irrigation channel, checking the water level. Today the channel is flowing well, the water moving in a slow current from the river. He walks its length, looking for blockages, for places where the bank has been eroded or damaged by the feet of animals crossing. There's nothing serious today. A small section of the bank has crumbled slightly where a goat has been. He'll repair it later. He reaches his field. In the growing season, this field would be covered in green. Knee-high emmer wheat, perhaps, or the feathery tops of barley. In the planting season, it would be bare, dark earth, freshly turned and waiting for seed. Today, let us say, it is the growing season, and the field is green, and the plants are at about waist height, and they move very slightly in the small morning breeze that comes off the river at this time of day. He walks the perimeter of the field looking at the plants. Here and there he crouches to look more closely at a section, checking for pests, for signs of disease, for any indication that the irrigation is uneven, that one part of the field is getting more water than another. He finds nothing alarming today. The morning light is fully on the field now, and it makes the green of the plants luminous. The Nile, visible in the distance from a slightly elevated point at the edge of the field, reflects the morning sky. Everything is quiet. He has work to do in the irrigation channel today, a section that needs clearing. He picks up the simple wooden tool he uses for this, something like a hoe with a flat blade, and begins to work. The work is rhythmic. Scoop the mud from the channel, pile it on the bank. Scoop and pile. Scoop and pile. The blade enters the soft mud with a quiet sound, a sort of submersion and draw that becomes, after a few minutes, simply the sound of the work, indistinguishable from the ambient sounds of the morning. He works for a while. His mind is not busy. He's not thinking about grand things. He's thinking about the channel, about whether this section is the worst one, or whether the section further along is worse. He is thinking about whether his younger son will be well enough to help with the field work today, since the boy has had a cough. He's thinking about the fact that last night's bread was a little gritty, which means the grinding stone is wearing down and perhaps needs to be replaced or at least turned to present a fresher surface. These are the things a farmer thinks about. The sun rises higher. The cool of the morning yields to the warmth of midday. The farmer takes a break from the irrigation work, sitting in the shade of the small acacia tree that grows at the corner of his field, one of the few trees that grow well in this part of Egypt, with its small feathery leaves that give a dappled shade. He eats the bread he brought with him, a flat round loaf, slightly stale from yesterday's baking but still good. He drinks from a small clay jar of water. He sits very still in the shade, watching the river. The Nile in the middle of the day is different from the Nile in the morning. The light is harsher now, coming from almost directly overhead, and the surface of the river is dazzling, painfully bright to look at directly. A few birds, ibises perhaps, the sacred bird of the god Thoth, wade at the edge of the river, picking at the mud with their long curved beaks. A heron stands motionless in the shallows, waiting with extraordinary patience for a fish to come close enough to strike. There are boats on the river. There are always boats on the river. A large wooden cargo boat moves slowly downstream, going north, carried by the current. It is loaded with something, pottery jars perhaps, or grain. Its sail is down, since it is going with the current and does not need the wind. 2 or 3 men are visible on its deck, moving slowly, tending to the rigging, watching the river ahead. A smaller boat made of papyrus is closer to the bank. 2 fishermen are in it, one at each end, handling a net stretched between them. They work slowly and in practiced coordination, walking the net along the bottom, then lifting it. Today the net comes up with a few fish. Not a lot, but something. The fish are dropped into a basket in the bottom of the boat, still moving. The farmer watches all of this without much thought. It is familiar. He has watched boats on the river his whole life. He has fished in the river himself when he was younger and had more time. He knows how to read the river, where the current runs fastest, where the shallows are, where the fish tend to congregate in different seasons. This knowledge is not bookish knowledge. It is the knowledge that comes from a lifetime of attention. A small breeze moves across the field. The grain stirs. The acacia leaves tremble slightly. It is pleasant, in the shade, in this moment. The bread is eaten. The water jar is empty. There is more work to be done, but for this one small pause, in the shade of the acacia tree by the river, the day is simply and unremarkably good. The afternoon is for heavier work. The irrigation channel that needs clearing is long, and the work takes most of the afternoon. It is not difficult work exactly, but it is constant, the kind of work that occupies the body while leaving the mind partly free. The kind of work that farm workers in all times and places have done, the work that is too repetitive to require full attention, but too physical to allow the mind to wander very far. The other sound of the afternoon is the shaduf, being worked by a neighbour a little distance away. The long pole dips and rises, the counterweight swings, the full bucket lifts, the water pours, and it starts again, dip and rise, dip and rise. The rhythm of it is almost like a heartbeat, a very slow heartbeat, counting off the afternoon. The farmer works, the shaduf works, the river runs. The sun moves across the sky in its great daily arc. The shadows lengthen. As the sun approaches the western cliffs, the light changes. It turns golden, then orange. The cliffs on the west bank catch the last of the sun's rays and glow with a warm amber light. The river turns the colour of copper. The air cools, and the small evening breeze comes off the river again, carrying the smell of the water, the smell of the wet mud, the smell that is the smell of Egypt, the smell that Egyptian soldiers on campaign in foreign lands dreamed of. The farmer packs up his tools. The work is done for today. It is never entirely done. There is always more to be done on a farm, always another section of channel that could be cleared, another repair that could be made. But today's work is done, and the evening is coming, and tomorrow is another day of the same work. He walks home along the same path he walked in the morning. The village is coming alive with the sounds of the evening. Children playing, the smell of fires being lit for cooking, the sound of women grinding grain, the voice of a neighbour calling to another. The donkey is being unloaded from its day's work, relieved of its burden with the patient, long-suffering acceptance that donkeys seem to bring to everything. At home, his wife is preparing the evening meal. The hearth is lit, the small clay oven beginning to produce heat. The bread is already made. It was made earlier, while he was in the fields. Tonight there is onion soup, a simple broth made with onions from the garden, flavoured with a little cumin, perhaps some dried herbs. There is the bread, there is the beer. The family eats together, sitting on the floor of the main room, the evening light coming in through the low door of the house. The meal is simple and sufficient. The beer is slightly warm but satisfying. The conversation is quiet. The day's events, the condition of the field, the neighbour's news, the health of the child with the cough, who is apparently a little better. After the meal, they sit for a while on the roof, catching the evening breeze. The sky's enormous overhead. The stars come out, familiar stars in familiar patterns. The Milky Way is visible, a pale band across the sky. The Nile is dark below, invisible in the gathering night, but audible. The quiet, constant sound of water. The family goes to bed. The children first, falling asleep quickly in the way that children do, dropping into sleep like stones into water. Then the parents, on their sleeping mats, in the relative cool of the house. The sounds of the village quiet down, one by one. The last fire dies, the last voice falls silent. The river runs, the stars turn slowly above the valley. The night continues its quiet work. This is a day in ancient Egypt, unremarkable, unheroic, uncelebrated. Not the kind of day that gets written about in the texts, that gets painted on the walls of tombs. Just a day, one of many thousands of days in one life, in one of many thousands of lives, along the banks of the river that made all these lives possible. This day is not unique. In its broad outline, it is the same day that this farmer's father lived, and his father before him, and his father before him, going back generations beyond memory. The irrigation channel has changed. The tools have been replaced. The specific fields have been adjusted by decades of work and planning. But the basic rhythm, the morning walk to the field, the hours of quiet work, the pause in the shade, the evening return, the simple meal, the sleep, this rhythm has not changed. It will not change in its essentials for many more generations to come. Let us rest here for a moment in this ordinary day. You may already be asleep. If you are, the sound of this voice may have become part of whatever you are dreaming, woven into the texture of your sleep. That is fine. More than fine. That is the point. If you are still listening, still following the story with the gentle, unfocused attention of someone who is very relaxed, then let me tell you that you are doing exactly the right thing. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The night is quiet around you, and the story will continue for as long as you need it to. If you find this channel helpful, if the slow pace of this kind of storytelling is what your mind needed tonight, a like on the video or a comment telling us what you thought of it would mean a great deal, but only if you feel like it. Only when you have a moment. The channel will be here whenever you need it. The river continues, and so does the story. Let us follow the Nile through the seasons one more time. The summer, Akhet, the flood season. It is July, or what we would call July. The days are very long and very hot. The sun rises early and sets late, and in between it beats down on the land with a relentless, unwavering intensity. In the fields, nothing is growing. The land is covered with water, the brown, silty water of the flood, which has spread outward from the river in the way it always does, covering the low-lying fields, lapping at the edges of the slightly higher ground on which the villages sit. The farmers who normally work the fields have retreated from them. There is no field work to be done during the flood. Instead, many of them are working on the pharaoh's projects, the building of a tomb, or a canal, or a wall, or a road. The flood season was the traditional time for large public works projects, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the flood season was the only time of year when large numbers of farm workers were available, since they couldn't work their fields. The water covers the fields slowly, gently. It does not rush in. The Egyptian flood is not a sudden, violent event, but a slow, patient spreading. Day by day the water level rises centimetre by centimetre, and the low fields disappear beneath it. Fish move into the flooded areas and can be caught there, which provides some supplementary food. Water birds gather in large flocks. ibises and egrets and herons and ducks, picking through the shallows for fish and frogs and invertebrates. The air smells different during the flood. The normal dusty dryness of the Egyptian air gives way to something moister, heavier, a smell of wet earth and vegetation and water. It is not an unpleasant smell, quite the opposite. After the long, dry months before the flood, the smell of water is welcome. It signals renewal, possibility, the return of the cycle. On the Nilometers, officials record the rising level. The measurements are sent north to the administrative centres, compared to previous year's records, analysed for what they portend. In a good year, a year when the flood reaches the ideal height, the reports carry good news. In a lean year when the flood seems to be stopping short of its ideal height, the reports carry anxiety. Everyone in Egypt, from the pharaoh in his palace to the farmer on his dry ground above the flood level, pays attention to the Nilometer readings. Because the Nilometer reading is, in a very literal sense, the reading of the future. The flood reaches its peak. This is the moment of greatest anxiety and greatest celebration. The moment when the flood is at its highest. When everything is determined. When the fate of the coming year is fixed. If the water is at the right height, there will be joy, celebration, offerings to Happy, music and dancing in the village squares. If it is too low, there will be quiet worry, careful planning, decisions about reserves and rations. The festival of the flood is celebrated in the villages and the cities. Food is shared, music is played. The sistrums rattle, and the lutes and harps sound in the evening. People eat and drink and pray and give thanks for the water, and then the water begins to recede. This is the most beautiful moment of the Egyptian agricultural year, or so it seems from this distance. The water pulling back from the fields, revealing the dark, smooth surface of the silt-covered earth. The fields emerging like something rising from beneath the water. First the highest ground, a dark island in the brown flood, and then gradually more and more, until the whole field has returned, slightly changed, renewed, covered in a fresh layer of the richest soil in the ancient world. The farmers return to their fields. They walk across the damp ground, feeling the give of the soft silt underfoot, smelling the particular smell of fresh flood deposit. Earthy, slightly organic, alive with the promise of growth. They check the irrigation channels which may have been damaged by the flood. They repair what needs repairing. They prepare for planting. The ploughing begins. The oxen are brought out, hitched to the wooden plough, led across the field in long, slow furrows. The farmer walks behind the plough, guiding it, watching the way the silt turns and breaks. The work is slow and steady. The plough moves at the pace of the oxen, which is slightly faster than walking, but not much. The furrows are close together, parallel lines running the length of the field. Between them, the silt is broken and loose, ready to receive the seed. The farmer walks along behind the plough and scatters seed from a bag hung across his body. Emmer wheat, or barley, or flax, depending on the field and the plan. The seed falls into the furrows, disappears into the dark earth. Then the animals are driven over the field to press the seeds in. Goats and sheep trotting across the planted field, their small hooves pressing into the soft ground, firming the soil over the seeds. This is an ancient technique, probably as old as agriculture itself. Practical, simple, effective. And then the waiting begins. The waiting is long. In the Egyptian climate, with its reliable sunshine and the irrigation water flowing through the channels, the crops grow relatively quickly. But still there are weeks between planting and the first signs of germination, and more weeks after that before the seedlings are established, and more weeks still before the grain is fully formed. During the growing season, the farmer tends his crops. He walks the fields in the early morning, looking at the plants, checking the irrigation, watching for signs of trouble. He clears weeds from between the rows. He checks the irrigation channels and adjusts the flow. He watches the sky for signs of what the weather will do, though in Egypt the weather is almost always the same, and watching the sky for surprises is rarely rewarding. There is something meditative about this kind of work. The daily walk through the field, the gentle attention paid to each section, the patient observation of slow growth. A good farmer develops a relationship with his field that is almost like the relationship between a parent and a child. Not sentimental exactly, but attentive and caring, noticing small changes that a less experienced eye would miss. A slight yellowing in one corner of the field might mean a drainage problem, or a nutrient deficiency, or the beginning of a disease. A section where the plants are shorter and thinner might mean the irrigation is reaching there less effectively. A patch of weeds that are particularly vigorous might be growing from a slightly different area of soil, one that perhaps received more silt or different silt in the flood. The farmer reads his field the way a skilled reader reads a text, not just the surface meaning, but the implications, the subtleties, the things that are not stated but can be inferred. Months pass. The growing season advances. The grain grows taller, from ankle height to knee height to waist height. The heads begin to form, first small and green, then swelling and yellowing as the grain inside the hull develops. The field changes colour, from bare dark earth to a haze of green to a dense nodding gold. The colour of ripe grain, in the Egyptian light, is very close to the colour of the stone of the cliffs, a warm, honeyed gold that seems almost to glow. The harvest is near. The farmer walks his field in the early morning and bends down to examine the grain heads. He pinches a few kernels from their hulls and rolls them between his fingers, feeling the hardness, the fullness. He rubs one between his teeth. Almost ready. A few more days. The preparations for the harvest begin. The sickles, short-handled, with slightly curved wooden frames strung with a blade of flint or sometimes of metal, are checked and sharpened. The baskets for carrying the cut grain are brought out and repaired where they have been damaged. The threshing floor, or the flat, hard-packed area where the grain will be processed, is swept and checked. And then, on the morning that the farmer decides is the right morning, the harvest begins. The whole family comes to the field. Neighbours come to help, because harvesting is communal work, and because a neighbour who helps with your harvest is a neighbour you will help with theirs. The workers spread across the field, each one working a section, moving through the grain with the rhythmic, steady motion of the sickle. Reach, grasp, cut, lay aside. Reach, grasp, cut, lay aside. The sound of the harvest is the sound of the sickles, a soft repeated cutting sound, and the sound of the grain falling, and the breathing of the workers, and occasionally a word exchanged between neighbours. Children too young for serious harvest work can still help, gathering the cut stalks, tying them into bundles, carrying water for the workers. By midday, a section of the field is cut and stacked. The workers rest in the shade of the pile of cut grain. Not a comfortable shade, but shade is shade in the Egyptian summer, and welcome from any source. They eat and drink. They rest for an hour, perhaps, before returning to the cutting. The afternoon is hotter, and the work is harder. But the end is in sight, and the end is a good one. The field that was full of grain this morning will be bare by evening, and the cut grain piled at the threshing floor will represent a year's survival. Not a good year in a dramatic sense, not a year that will be remembered or celebrated in the great historical records. Just a year of enough grain for the family, enough grain for the tax payment, enough grain for the reserve that will carry them through the lean months. A year of enough. And at the end of such a year, when the grain is threshed and winnowed and measured and stored, and the jars are full and the granary door is closed, there is a quiet satisfaction that requires no celebration, no monument, no commemoration. The satisfaction of a thing done well, a cycle completed, a year survived. The farmer walks back from the granary to his house in the evening. The field is bare behind him. Above the empty field, the sky is turning its familiar evening colours. The river is there, in the distance, running quietly past, as it has always run, as it will always run. He goes home. He eats his bread and drinks his beer. He sleeps. This is the rhythm of ancient Egypt. Not the pyramids, not the mummies, not the gold. Not the pharaohs and their wars and their monuments. Those things are real, and they are extraordinary, and they deserve all the attention they have received over the centuries. But underneath all of that, beneath the grandeur and the art and the theology and the politics, was this rhythm. The flood, the planting, the growing, the harvest, the waiting. And the river running past, always and always, the brown, slow, patient river, carrying the life of the mountains far to the south, down to the fields of Egypt. This is what it meant to build a civilization around a river's bad habit. The habit in question, the annual flooding, was not really a bad habit at all. It was the most generous habit a river could have, the gift of renewed fertility, year after year, without fail. The Egyptians knew this. They celebrated it, worshipped it, organised their entire calendar around it. They built their houses of river mud, and their temples of river-transported stone, and their society on the surplus of river-watered grain. They wrote poems to the river and prayers to the god of the flood. They measured the river's height with instruments of extraordinary precision and made decisions about the fate of millions based on those measurements. And generation after generation, they slept within earshot of the river, in their houses of mud brick on the slightly elevated ground above the flood plain, listening to the sound of the water moving in the darkness, trusting that tomorrow the river would still be there. It was still there. It is still there. You are still here too. And that is all you need to be, right now, in this moment, still here, still breathing, letting the story wash past you like the current of a river. The Nile does not judge. The Nile does not demand. The Nile simply runs and deposits its gifts and runs again. Let your mind be like the flood, just for these last quiet minutes. Let it spread gently outward, not toward anything in particular, just outward, covering the low places of the day, settling into stillness. Whatever is waiting for you tomorrow, whatever work or worry or planning or effort is waiting on the other side of this night, it will still be there. The morning will come, reliable as the annual flood, and you will be ready for it. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only the river. Let us drift a little further through the details. In the Egyptian village on an ordinary night, the animals sleep in their pens near the house. The donkey, tethered to a post, dozes with its head hanging down, its breath slow and even. The goats are still, pressed together for warmth. The dog, Egyptian dogs were common, kept for hunting and for guarding, has settled at the threshold of the house, in the place between inside and outside. The potter's kiln at the edge of the village has gone cold. The last fire was put out an hour ago. In the morning it will be lit again, and the clay pots that were shaped today will be fired into permanence. They will harden from soft, malleable clay into the fired ceramic that can hold water, that can be buried in the ground for 3,000 years and still be found, still intact, still recognisable. The weaver's loom stands empty in the house of the weaver. The threads are stretched on the warp, waiting for the morning, waiting for the shuttle to begin its patient passage back and forth. Linen thread made from flax wound into a tight ball and set beside the loom. Tomorrow the cloth will be a little longer, the day after longer still. Over weeks a length of linen will emerge from the loom, soft and slightly stiff with the fibres, that will become a garment or a piece of household cloth, or a bandage or a sail. The scribe's brush and palette are put away for the night. The papyrus scroll, carefully rolled and tied, is put in its cylindrical case. The documents of the day, the records of grain received, of workers' rations distributed, of measurements taken from the Nilometer, are finished and put away. Tomorrow there will be more records to make. There are always more records to make. The scribes of ancient Egypt were never short of work. The temple on the eastern bank is quiet. The inner sanctuary is dark, the divine statue standing in the darkness, the incense from the evening ritual still faintly perceptible in the air. The priests have gone to their quarters. The flame of the eternal lamp burns very low in one corner of the sanctuary, a small point of light in a large darkness. Outside the temple, the sacred lake is still. The surface reflects the stars. The fish in the sacred lake, temple fish, kept to be fed by the priests, are still in the dark water, suspended motionless in the way fish rest when they are not actively feeding. The bakers have gone to bed. They will wake before the rest of the village to begin the bread for the next day. The dough must be mixed and left to rise, and the mixing must happen while it is still dark, so that the baking can begin early enough to have bread ready for the first meal of the day. The baker's hours are long and unglamorous. Early mornings in a hot and smoky space, the same repetitive motions, the kneading and shaping and sliding the loaves into the oven on long wooden paddles. But the bread is essential, and the baker is never without work. The fishermen who went out at dawn have long since returned. Their catch has been sold or distributed, the net has been hung to dry, the papyrus boat has been pulled up on the bank and left there, upside down. Tomorrow they will go out again, and they will bring in whatever the river offers. Sometimes it is a good catch. Sometimes it is not much. The river decides. The river always decides. It is late. Or perhaps it is early. In the depths of the night the two are indistinguishable. The Nile runs in darkness. Its surface is barely visible. A slightly lighter darkness within the darkness. A moving thing in a still world. The stars reflect from it in broken rippling patterns, shattered and reassembled with each small movement of the water. A crocodile in ancient times would lie at the water's edge still as a log. The crocodile was present in the Nile from the time of the earliest Egyptians. It was worshipped in some places and feared in all of them. The god Sobek was depicted with a crocodile's head. He was a god of water and fertility, dangerous and powerful like the river itself. There are no crocodiles now in the Egyptian Nile below the Aswan Dam. They still exist further south, in the reservoirs and tributaries of Sudan and Uganda. But in the ancient Nile, in the Nile of the world we have been exploring tonight, the crocodile was a real and present danger. Farmers who worked near the water, fishermen in their papyrus boats, children playing at the river's edge, all of them were aware of the crocodile. All of them kept some part of their attention on the water. This too was part of the river's character. Not just generous, not just life-giving, but also dangerous, also unpredictable in its local way, even if reliable in its larger cycle. The hippopotamus too, large, territorial, capable of capsizing boats and killing people who came too close. The cobra, which lived in the grain fields and in the crevices of stone walls. The scorpion, which sheltered under rocks and in the dark corners of houses. Life in ancient Egypt was not an idyll. It was a life lived in close proximity to real dangers, real hardships, real suffering. The mummies tell us about the conditions they experienced. parasites from the Nile water, eye infections from the constant dust and sand, the tooth wear from gritty bread, the joint disease from years of hard physical labour. The medical papyri tell us about the ailments they treated: infected wounds, broken bones, difficult childbirths, fevers from malaria, which was endemic in the Nile Delta, and from other diseases. And yet, the civilization endured. The people lived their lives generation after generation along the banks of the river. They planted and harvested and made pottery and wove linen and wrote their texts and built their temples and buried their dead and raised their children and worshipped their gods and watched the river rise and fall. They were, in the end, people, just people, like us, in their essentials, worried about their families, hoping for a good harvest, grateful for simple pleasures, a cool morning after a hot night, a good meal at the end of a long day, the smile of a child. The river connected them to us across the distance of thousands of years, and it connects us tonight to them. We're nearing the end of this long, slow journey. You've travelled a great distance tonight, not in miles, but in time. You've moved through thousands of years of human history, from the banks of a river in ancient Egypt to the fields of Mesopotamia and India and China, and back again to the same river in the same evening light, at the same quiet hour before sleep. The world you have been visiting tonight is not lost. It exists, in its fragments, in its ruins, in its texts, in its mummies, in its art. It exists in the Nilometer at Elephantine, still standing. It exists in the hypostyle hall at Karnak, where the columns rise 30 metres into the Egyptian sky. It exists in the mummies of the pharaohs, resting in their climate-controlled cases in the Cairo Museum. It exists in the papyrus scrolls in the museums of Europe and America and Egypt, their ink still black, their words still legible. It exists in the river. The Nile is still there. It has been changed. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, has controlled the annual flood, eliminating the inundation that was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. The dark silt no longer spreads across the Egyptian fields each summer. The Nilometers are no longer the centre of an anxious annual calculation. The flood seasons, the planting season, the harvest season, the 3 seasons of the Egyptian year, are no longer marked by the river. Modern Egypt uses artificial fertilizers instead of Nile silt. It pumps Nile water through a complex system of modern irrigation canals instead of relying on the annual inundation. The fields are green year-round now, not just in the growing season. The productivity is, in some ways, higher, but something has been lost. Not just the Nile silt, which was extraordinarily fertile and is now accumulating behind the dam instead of spreading across the fields. Not just the cycle of flood and retreat that gave the Egyptian year its rhythm. Something less tangible has been lost. The intimacy between a civilization and its river, the sense of dependence on a natural cycle that you could observe but not control, that you could read but not rewrite. The ancient Egyptians did not control the Nile. They worked with it, around it, within its constraints. They organised their entire civilization around what the river did, rather than trying to change what the river did. And the river, in return, gave them everything they needed. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of ancient Egypt. Not a lesson about engineering or administration or military power or religious sophistication, though Egypt had all of these in abundance, but a lesson about the relationship between a people and a place, between a civilization and the natural force that made it possible. The Nile flooded. The Egyptians built around the flood, and for 3,000 years the arrangement worked. The night deepens. In the ancient village the last sounds have faded. The river runs. The stars move through their slow arcs above the valley. The mud brick houses stand in the darkness, their thick walls slowly releasing the heat of the day into the cool night air. A child turns over on its sleeping mat and is still again. The farmer sleeps, his body heavy with the day's work, his breathing deep and regular. His wife sleeps beside him. Somewhere in the house, the clay jar of water sits covered with its flat pottery lid, waiting for morning. The field is dark and still. The irrigation channel runs quietly, a small sound of moving water in the silence. In the field, the grain, whatever season it is, let us say it is the growing season, stands in its ordered rows, the plants turning slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward where the sun will rise. The river runs, as it always has, as it always will. And somewhere, many thousands of years from now, someone is lying in the dark, listening to a voice tell them about all of this, and drifting slowly and gently into sleep, that someone might be you. The river keeps running. Sleep well. This has been a long journey through ancient Egypt, through the story of the Nile and the civilization that grew along its banks, through the fields and villages and temples and tombs of a people who built one of the great wonders of human history around the simple, generous fact of a river's annual flood. If you found your way here tonight through a search or a recommendation, and if you are still listening at this late hour, or if you woke to finish listening after sleeping through the middle, we're glad you're here. This channel, at Sleep Chrono, exists for exactly this purpose, to accompany you through the night, to give your mind something soft and unhurried to follow as the day releases its hold. If this was helpful, if you find yourself returning on another night, a like or a comment or a subscription would mean a great deal. They help others find what you found tonight. But if you are too sleepy to do any of that right now, if your eyes are heavy and the device is already slipping from your hand, that is exactly right. That is exactly as it should be. Sleep well. The Nile is still running somewhere in the darkness, patient and generous, carrying the water of distant mountains down to the sea. The river runs, and you are resting. Good night.